In the last dying blizzard of the Arizona territory, 3 strands of fence wire lay severed by a single clean stroke. 12 horses thundered into a box canyon where snow and rock would finish what deliberate hands had begun. On the porch of a low-gray ranch house, a man sat motionless. The coffee in his cup had gone cold an hour before. He no longer felt it. 3 days of empty pasture. 3 days of calling names into a wind that gave nothing back. Then the sound reached him. Hooves, not one, not two. A full string moving together across frozen rock. The layered rhythm of animals that should have been dead. Out of the shadowed switchback they came bunched tight, then opening into the yard. Behind them rode a figure on a mule the color of wet ash, rope coiled easy in one hand, as if pulling a man's entire life out of a killing canyon was simply the work the day required. Someone had already decided this water was worth more than those lives. And the second storm was turning. Arizona Territory, 1,865, a work of fiction, set against a real place in a real time, but the people and events are invented. The ranch sat where the foothills gave way to open valley, low and gray timbered against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to clear. A house of 2 rooms grown to 4, a barn built stouter than the house, because a man learns early in this country which structure matters more to his survival. A scatter of corral fence running out toward pastures that, this particular morning, held nothing living in them at all. Wood smoke rose thin and reluctant from the chimney, bent sideways by a wind that hadn't fully let go of the storm, even though the storm itself had passed 2 nights before. The coffee had gone cold an hour before Amos Hartwell noticed it was still in his hand. He didn't drink it. He just held it, because holding something, anything, was better than the alternative, which was sitting on that porch step with his hands empty and nothing left to hold on to at all. His boots were by the door. He'd set them there the night before, pulled them off, lined them up heel to the wall the way Ruth used to make him do, and told himself that was that. No more riding out. No more drawing circles through the draws in the rock washes in the frozen creek bottoms, calling names that never answered back. 3 days of it. 3 days was enough to know. 12 horses, gone. He said the number in his head again, the way a man worries a sore tooth with his tongue, even though he knows better. 12. The whole breeding string. 11 years of choosing which mare to which stud, which bloodline through the straighter leg, which cross gave you the deep chest and the easy trot that buyers paid real money for. 11 years, and 2 nights of blizzard wind had taken it all and scattered it into country that didn't give anything back once it took it. He was 43 years old. His knees told him that every morning, whether he asked or not, and this particular morning, they were telling him louder than usual, because he'd spent 3 days in the saddle for nothing. 43. A ranch that cleared a decent profit maybe 1 year in 3. No horses, no sons to hand any of it to. Not that there'd ever been a chance of that. Just him, and the quiet, and a porch step, and a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand because he'd forgotten it was there. That was the arithmetic. He'd done it 100 times since the storm broke, lying awake, staring at the low beam over the bed, where Ruth used to hang the dried chilis every fall. The number never came out different no matter how he ran it. 43 years old, and here it was. The second time in his life the ground had gone out from under him. The first time had been the fever that took her. 15 years back now. 15 years, and some mornings it still felt like a wall he'd walked into in the dark. He knew this feeling, this particular stillness. He'd felt it once before, in the bad years right after, when he'd had to sell down to nothing but 2 studs, and a debt he thought might bury him. The land went quiet then too, like it was waiting to see what he'd do, except there was nothing to do. You just sat. You let the cold come in under the door, and you let the coffee go cold in your hand, and you stopped fighting the thing that had already won. He thought about Ruth's ledger. The careful hand she wrote in, numbers lined up like soldiers, no crossouts, because she never wrote a figure until she was sure of it. She'd have looked at this. 12 horses, gone in a storm, and a man too old and too tired to start again. She wouldn't have flinched from it. She never did. She'd have set the coffee down, picked up the pencil, and told him exactly what was true, whether he wanted to hear it or not. He missed that. 15 years, and he still missed the particular way she held a pencil, like it owed her something. He thought back, because there was nothing else to do with the dark before dawn, except let it drag him backward. 22 years since he'd first driven a stake into this ground and called it his. 22 years since Ruth had stood beside him on bare dirt where the house wasn't yet and said, "Well, we'd better get started then." Like the whole endeavor was a chore to be gotten through rather than a life to be built. They'd built it together. 2 rooms first, then 4. A well that took him a summer of digging to reach water worth having. Cattle before the horses, He'd run cattle the first 9 years, because cattle were what a sensible man ran, and he and Ruth had never once during that stretch called themselves anything but sensible. Then the fever took her, and sensible stopped mattering to him for the better part of 2 years. He didn't like remembering those years, and so he mostly didn't, except in the hour before dawn when a man's guard is down, and his mind goes wherever it wants without asking his permission first. He remembered selling down to the last 2 studs because he couldn't feed what he had and couldn't make himself care whether he fed it or not. He remembered the neighbor women bringing food he didn't eat, setting it on the step because he wouldn't open the door, because opening the door meant talking, and talking meant admitting how far under he'd gone. He remembered, somewhere in the 2nd year, deciding it was easier to breed something new than to keep feeding grief on an empty stomach. Horses, not cattle. A clean start, or as clean as a start could be for a man already 32 years old and half convinced his best years were sitting in a grave under a cottonwood a quarter-mile from the house. He'd bought the foundation mare with money he didn't rightly have, at a horse sale 2 counties over, because he'd looked at her for exactly as long as it takes to draw one breath and known, not hoped, no, what she'd throw, what her get would carry in the shoulder, and the eye, the kind of foal a man could build 11 careful years on top of. He'd been right about her. He'd been right about most of it if he was honest, and the hour before dawn generally made him honest whether he asked for that or not. 43 now, which didn't feel old. Most days, except on mornings like this one, when his knees answered a question before his mind had finished asking it. Because there's a particular arithmetic that starts running in a man's head somewhere past 40, whether he invites it or not. How many years are left? How many of those years still have working knees in them? Whether starting over a second time, at his age, with this little standing, is even a thing a sensible man attempts, or whether sensible men know better by now than to attempt it at all. The Denby place 2 miles east hadn't sent so much as a rider to ask if he needed help these 3 days. The word of a man losing his whole string to a storm travels a small valley fast enough on its own legs. He didn't hold it against them exactly. A man who loses horses twice in one lifetime starts to look, in a valley this size, less like a man having bad luck and more like a man luck has stopped visiting on purpose. He'd watched it happen to other men before him. He understood, without much liking it, that it was probably starting to happen to him. He didn't have an answer for any of it. He'd been running the numbers all night, and they kept landing in the same unkind place. Which was maybe why, when the sound finally came, some small stubborn part of him refused, for one full second, to believe it was real. The gray was coming up slow in the east. He watched it because there was nothing else worth watching. A man alone on a porch in the cold hour before dawn will find himself doing that, watching gray turn to less gray, waiting on nothing, and then he didn't understand it, not at first. His mind was somewhere back in November, back in the fever year, back anywhere but here, but his body understood before his mind caught up, because his body had spent 43 years listening to that particular sound and knew it before he did. Not one horse, not 2, a string. The scatter of it, the particular rhythm a group of horses makes moving together on rock, uneven and layered, one animal's stride landing inside another's, was a sound he'd have known blind, known deaf, known in his sleep, because he'd built that sound with his own 2 hands over 11 years, and then lost it 3 days ago and told himself he'd never hear it again. He was on his feet before he decided to stand. The cup was still in his hand. He didn't remember choosing to keep holding it. He just was. The whole ranch seemed to hold its breath with him. Behind the house, the 2 barn cats went still on the woodpile, ears swiveled toward the sound before his own had fully placed it. Out past the corral, the 3 hens he kept more from habit than usefulness lifted their heads together the way animals do when they've caught something a man is still catching up to. Even the wind, which hadn't let up in 3 days, seemed for one long suspended moment to lose interest in blowing. He set the cup down at last, though he couldn't have said exactly when his hand let go of it, and walked to the edge of the yard, boots crunching over crusted snow that hadn't fully given up its grip on the ground, even with the sun climbing behind the ridge. His breath came out of him in short, pale clouds. His heart was doing something in his chest he hadn't asked it to do, something too fast and too large for a man who'd already made his peace. The night before, with an empty pasture and a quiet barn and whatever was left of a life built mostly around horses that were no longer his to build around. The eastern ridge caught the first real light of morning, gold along its spine, the snow up there gone the particular rose-gold color it only holds for a few minutes after sunrise, before the day settles into its ordinary gray. Below that light, the trail down from the high country was still mostly shadow. The switchback cut into the rock face like a scar healed crooked, and it was out of that shadow, out of that narrow, crooked scar in the mountain, that the sound kept coming toward him. Around the bend where the trail narrowed against the rock face, they came, bunched tight at first where the path pinched down, then opening out as they cleared it. He started counting without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. He got to 8, and then his mind stopped doing arithmetic on the horses and started trying to make sense of what was behind them. A rider, on a mule the color of wet ash, homely headed, the kind of animal that made no sense at all in a livery stable and perfect sense on a mountain trail. The rider sat the saddle easy, unhurried, like she'd been at this since well before light, and expected to keep at it well past noon if that's what the day required. A coat gone gray-brown with weather. Dark hair, most of it pulled back and covered by a hat, too broad for her, sitting low over her brow, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting against her leg, holding a coiled length of rope, the particular way a person holds rope, when they've used it more than once this morning and expect to use it again before the day is done. She rode those 12 horses straight into his yard, like she'd been to this place 100 times, though he'd never laid eyes on her in his life. And she brought them to a stop in a manner that told him this wasn't the first string of loose stock. He finished counting. 12. He counted again anyway. It was a foolish thing to do, count a number he already had. But grief does that to a man. Makes him check the good news twice, because he doesn't trust it not to be a trick of the light. She looked at him across the yard. Didn't smile, didn't frown either. Just looked the way a person looks at something they're deciding whether to trust. He's yours. 2 words, that was all. And he stood there with a cold cup of coffee in his hand, and 43 years of his life, arranged in a line behind him, and could not for a long moment make his mouth produce a single sound in reply. Yes, he finally managed. They're mine. She nodded once. Like that settled a question she'd already more or less answered for herself. Found them box canyoned up past the second ridge. Sorrel mare there. She tipped her chin toward a horse standing a little apart from the others. Favoring a hind leg, had herself wedged between 2 rock faces. Leg caught in a crack, running the length of it. Took most of the morning working her loose without breaking anything worse. He looked at the mare. He looked at the woman. He looked back at the mare. She's sound? She's sound enough. Watch that leg 2-3 days. It's not broke. She fought it a good while before I found her, though, and a leg that's fought something knows it. He set the cup down on the porch rail without looking at it, because his hands had started shaking slightly and he didn't want her to see that, though he suspected she already had. People who read a mare's leg from 30 feet in poor light tend to read most things. How'd you find them? Tracked them off the storm line. Wasn't difficult once the wind laid down. 12 animals moving together leave a story even a careless eye could follow, and I wasn't being careless. How'd you know they were mine? She nodded toward the gate at the south pasture. Brand plate on the post. Same mark on every animal in the string. Didn't take much figuring. He looked at the gate. He'd nailed that plate up 8 years ago and hadn't thought about it since, the way you stop noticing your own name on a thing after enough time passes. It had never once occurred to him that a stranger might use it to bring his whole life back to him in a single morning. I'm obliged to you, he said. It came out smaller than he meant it, but it was the truest thing he'd said out loud in 3 days. Wasn't out of my way. She said it plain. Not modest, not proud. Just a fact laid down flat, the way she seemed to lay most things down. They'd have died in that canyon inside the week. Snow's coming again before long, and there's no forage up there this time of year. Figured whoever they belonged to would rather have them than not. He looked at her a long moment, studied the coat, the hat too big for her head, the easy way she held that rope like her hands had never once in her life not known what to do with one. You've come a long way, he said. Not quite a question. 29 days, she said. Give or take 29 days. He turned that number over the way he'd been turning over his own numbers all night, except this one had nothing bad in it. This one was just strange, a fact he couldn't yet place anywhere. A woman alone, 29 days on a mule through country that had swallowed better armed men than her without leaving a trace. And she'd spent this particular morning of it pulling his horses out of a rock crevice for no reason except that. Leaving them there struck her as wrong. You've got a name? He asked. Wren, she said. Just that. No more offered, and something in the flatness of the single word told him not to reach for more. He didn't. He'd lived enough years and buried enough of his own history to know when a door was being held only partway open, and to know better than to lean on it. Amos Hartwell, he said. She nodded again. Filing it, the way she seemed to file everything, and looked past him toward the barn. You've got water troughs this way. He led her to it. She didn't wait to be shown twice. Brought the mule to it herself. Let him drink. and while the animal drank, she crouched and ran her hand down each of his forelegs in turn, checking, he understood, for stone bruising. Picked up somewhere on 29 days of trail. That hadn't asked her permission to be hard on an animal's feet. She did it without being asked. She did it the way a person does, a thing they've done 10,000 times before, and will do 10,000 times again, not for praise, not for an audience, just because the animal needed it, and she happened to be standing there. Her gear, he noticed while she worked, was the gear of someone who traveled expecting trouble and had made her peace with that expectation a long while back. A bedroll lashed tight and weathered. A second canteen, empty, kept for water she hadn't found yet but meant to. A skinning knife worn smooth at the handle from years of use, worn the particular way tools get worn by hands that reach for them without having to look first. Nothing wasted. Nothing carried that didn't earn its place on that mule's back across 29 hard days. He watched her and thought of Ruth and was surprised by the thought and didn't examine why. He led the 12 in one by one after that, because counting them from a distance wasn't the same as putting a hand on each animal and confirming with his own palms that they were real. The bay stud colt first barely broke to lead, dancing sideways at the end of the rope the way young colts do when they've had 3 days to remember they were once afraid of everything. He ran a hand down each leg anyway, checking for heat, for swelling, for the small tells that would mean trouble later if he missed them now. Sound, all 4 legs sound. Next, the 2 yearling fillies, sisters out of the same cross, the ones he'd been most excited about back in the fall, before the storm made excitement feel like something that happened to other men. He checked their feet, their eyes, the set of their ears, and found nothing wrong with either one that 3 hard days hadn't already started mending on its own. He went down the line that way, animal by animal, and with each one that came up sound. Something in his chest loosened another fraction, the way a closed fist loosens finger by finger instead of all at once. The old gray gelding, 20 years old and stays a fence post, the first horse he'd ever broken to harness back when he still ran cattle, and kept this one around out of stubborn affection more than use. The 2 geldings he'd meant to sell come spring, a sale that had felt, 3 days ago, like it would never happen because there'd be nothing left worth selling. And last, the foundation mare herself. Older now, her back swayed slightly with the years, but her eye was clear and her legs were clean, and she nickered low in her throat when he ran his hand along her neck, the particular sound she'd made at him for 11 years whenever he came near, half greeting and half demand for the grain she assumed he was carrying. "You," he said to her, quiet, the word coming out rougher than he'd meant it to. "You were supposed to be gone." The mare pushed her nose into his shoulder, unbothered by the sentiment, wanting the grain regardless of what weight the moment happened, to be carrying for the man attached to the hand that fed her. He laughed. It surprised him, the sound of it, because he couldn't remember the last time laughing had happened to him without his deciding to do it first. He stood there a moment with his forehead against her neck, breathing in the smell of horse and cold and hay, and let himself, for the first time in 3 days, believe all the way down that this was real, and not one more trick his grief was playing on him before dawn. He turned the 11 sound horses out into the south pasture while Wren finished with the mule, and the whole while he did it his hands would not entirely stop shaking. Not from cold, he told himself that, and mostly believed it. The sorrel mare he led instead into the small paddock alone, away from the others, the way you separate an injured animal so it isn't jostled and so you can watch it plain. He crouched by her hind leg the way Wren had described, finding her and ran his palm down the swelling, from the knee to the fetlock, and felt the mare's whole body go tense and then slowly, not tense, the way an animal does when it decides, against its instinct, to trust the hand that's touching it. "She'll hold weight on it inside the week," Wren said. She'd come up behind him without his hearing her, which was its own small unsettling fact about her, that a person could cross a working yard in boots and not be heard doing it. "You'll want to keep her off rock ground till then. Turf if you've got it. I've got turf." He stood, and his knees complained about it, and he didn't try to hide the wince, because there wasn't much point pretending to a stranger. That 43 years hadn't happened to him. He stood in that paddock a while just looking, at the mare, at all 12 of them, out past the fence, moving loose and unhurried through the south pasture, like nothing at all had happened to them, like they hadn't spent 3 days lost in country that had already, in his mind, finished the job of killing them. An hour before, he'd have told you they were gone. He'd have told you it with a certainty he'd earned the hard way, the certainty of a man who'd already set his boots by the door and made his peace or something close enough to peace to fool himself with for one long cold night. And now they were standing in his pasture eating his hay, like the storm had never happened at all. He didn't understand yet how much he didn't understand. That would come later. Right now there was only the fact of the horses, breathing, moving, alive, and a woman standing at the paddock rail beside him, with mud on her boots, and 29 days of trail written into the set of her shoulders, and the light coming up gray, and then less gray over the ridge behind them. "You'll stay to supper," he said. It wasn't quite a question either. It came out of him before he'd decided to say it, the way the standing up had, the way most things that morning seemed to be happening before he'd caught up to them. She looked at him, considered it the way she seemed to consider everything, without rush, without performance. "I'll water the mule first," she said, which wasn't yes, but wasn't no either, and he understood well enough by then that with her, that was probably as close to an answer as he'd get. She spent the better part of the afternoon at the small paddock instead, longer than the mare strictly required, and Amos found reasons of his own to stay near the barn while she did it, mending a hinge that had been mended twice already, and didn't need a third time if he was honest about it. She worked slow with the mare, ran her palm along the swollen leg in long even strokes, not hurrying, talking to the animal now and then in a low voice pitched too quiet for him to make out the words, though he didn't think the words mattered near as much as the tone carrying them. The mare, wary at first the way any hurt animal is wary of a new hand, gradually stopped flinching at the touch, and stood instead with her head low and her weight easy, the particular stillness of a creature that has decided, against its instinct, that this hand means it no harm. "You've a way with them," he said, from the fence, not quite meaning to say it out loud. "Had to learn it early. Wasn't a luxury where I grew up, having a way with animals. Was closer to a requirement." She didn't look up from the mare's leg. "You lose an animal where I'm from, you don't just lose the animal. You lose what the animal was going to carry you through. The winter, the work. Sometimes the difference between eating and not. Same here some years, I expect it is." She straightened, wiping her hands on her trousers, and looked at him across the paddock rail, with something that might have been the beginning of real regard, though he wasn't yet sure enough of her to call it that plainly. 11 years building this string. That's not nothing. Most men don't have the patience for it. They want the fast cross, the quick sale, and they wonder later why the foals don't hold together the way they'd hoped. My wife used to say patience was the only thing I had in surplus. He hadn't meant to bring Ruth into it again, not twice in one day to a stranger, but the words came anyway, the way they seemed to be doing more and more since sunrise. Said I'd have made a poor gambler and a fine farmer, on account of I was willing to wait on a thing longer than most men could. She sounds like she knew you well. She did. He looked past Wren, out at the 11 sound horses grazing easy in the last of the afternoon light, and felt the particular ache that came whenever he let himself hold Ruth and the ranch in his mind at the same time, the two things so tangled together after 22 years that he could no longer entirely separate the grief for one from his pride in the other. "Better than I knew myself most days." Wren didn't answer that right away. She turned back to the mare, checking the leg once more, though it plainly didn't need checking again, and when she finally spoke her voice had gone quieter, more careful, the voice of someone choosing to walk into a room she wasn't certain she'd been invited into. 15 years is a long time to carry a person around inside you," she said. "Doesn't get any lighter, I don't imagine. Just gets easier to carry. That's about the size of it." He studied her a moment. "You sound like you know something about carrying people around." "I know something about it," she said, and didn't say more, and he let that be enough, the way he'd let the other closed doors be enough, because a man learns, if he lives long enough and loses enough, that some rooms in a person are theirs to open in their own time or not at all. She stayed. He made what he had, which by his own admission wasn't much. Salt pork gone a little too salty from sitting too long in the brine. Cornbread he'd made 2 mornings back, when he still had reason to make anything at all. The last of a jar of pickled beets he'd been keeping for no occasion in particular, because there hadn't been an occasion in longer than he cared to count. She ate all of it. Didn't comment on it, good or bad, which he found he respected more than he'd have expected to. Some people, faced with plain food from a man clearly living alone, made a show of finding it charming or forgivable or worse, pitiable. She did none of that. She ate like a person who understood food was fuel first and pleasure, only when pleasure happened to be available, and didn't waste breath on ceremony either way. They sat at the table, coffee going between them, and the quiet in the room was not the same quiet that had sat with him on the porch that morning. This was a different kind, not empty. Occupied somehow by the fact of another person breathing across from him. "You've had this place long?" she asked. 22 years. On your own? 15 of those. My wife," he stopped. "Started again, Ruth. She passed fever. 15 years back now." Ren didn't say she was sorry. He noticed that, and was grateful for it in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't buried someone and then spent a decade and a half hearing the same three worn smooth words from every well-meaning mouth in the territory. 22 years, she said instead. "That's a long time to build something. Wasn't always building. Some of it was losing. Most building is." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. There was something in the flatness of the way she said things, the total absence of decoration that reminded him so sharply of Ruth that for one unsteady second he had to look away and study the grain of the table instead. "You know horses," he said when he trusted his voice again. It wasn't a question either. Nothing between them yet seemed to want to be a question. Exactly. More like statements offered and either taken up or set gently aside. Grew up around stock. Mules mostly. Some horses. You learn what an animal's telling you, or you don't. And if you don't, you lose animals. And I never had enough of them to spare losing any. Where's home? The question sat in the room a moment before she answered it, and he understood, watching her face, that he'd stepped somewhere he hadn't meant to step. Not into anger, into something more careful than that. A door closing, not slammed, just eased shut, quiet and deliberate. "Not here," she said. "Not anymore." He let it sit, didn't push. He'd learned that much in 43 years. If he'd learned nothing else, that a door closed quiet deserved to be left closed, and a man who forced it open usually broke something in the process that didn't mend easy. "I'm headed toward the mining camps," she said, after a moment, offering this much instead, the way a person offers a smaller truth in place of a larger one they're not ready to hand over. "There's work there. Cooking, mending, tending stock. I've done all three. 29 days is a hard way to get to work." It was the way that was open. He wanted to ask more. He didn't. Not right away. 29 days is a long way to travel on faith. "That work'll still be there when you arrive," he said instead. Faith wasn't much involved in it, she said. Necessity was. Some difference between the two. Not as much as men like to think. She turned her cup slowly in her hands, not drinking from it, just turning it, the way a person handles something to keep their hands occupied while their mind goes somewhere they'd rather not narrate out loud. "Where I'm from isn't a place anymore, not the way it was. That's the whole of what I'll say about it tonight." He nodded. Didn't push. He understood. In a rough general way, he suspected was rougher than he wanted to admit. What kind of story sat behind a sentence like that in this territory in this year? He'd heard talk in town, seen columns of soldiers moving through on business that was never fully explained to men who weren't soldiers. He hadn't thought much about any of it before tonight, the way a man doesn't think much about weather in a county he's never had to ride through. He was thinking about it now. "That why you're alone?" he asked, and regretted the bluntness of it, almost before it finished leaving his mouth. She looked at him steady, no anger in it, which somehow made him feel worse than anger would have. "I'm alone because I decided being alone, and moving was better than staying anywhere long enough to be told to move again by somebody else's say-so. There's people who'd tell you that's not much of a choice. I've found it's more of one than it looks. That's a hard way to live. 22 years alone on a ranch isn't the easy way either," she said, and there was the faintest edge of something in it, not quite humor, but kin to it, close enough that he felt the tension in his own shoulders ease a fraction. "We're neither of us here because the easy road had room for us." He huffed something that was almost a laugh. "No, suppose we're not." She set the cup down. "I'll say this much more, and then I'd rather talk about horses. I've had enough of people's pity for one lifetime, and I can generally tell inside a sentence or two whether that's where a conversation's headed. Yours wasn't. I'd like to keep it that way." "No pity here," he said. "I don't have the surplus for it. Barely got enough left over for my own troubles." That earned him the closest thing to a real smile he'd seen from her yet. Quick, there and gone, but real. He topped off her coffee and his own and let the subject move on to something easier to carry, which was, as it turned out, still horses. He told her about the breeding program, 11 years of it, the foundation mare he'd bought at a price he still, 4 years later, hadn't fully admitted to anyone, because he'd known the first time he laid eyes on her exactly what she'd throw, and he'd been right. And being right about that mare was one of the few things in his life he let himself feel plain pride about. She listened the way a person listens when they actually want the information, not the way people listen when they're being polite and waiting for their turn to talk. She asked good questions, not showy ones, meant to prove she knew something. Practical ones. What he crossed the foundation mare to and why. Whether he'd had trouble with the line's temperament, given how highly he prized the shoulder and the eye. Whether the bay stud colt was going to throw the same length of stride his sire carried, or whether he'd taken more after the dam side, which ran shorter but sounder in the hock. He found himself talking longer than he'd meant to, laying out 11 years of decisions the way another man might lay out a hand of cards he was finally proud enough of to show somebody. Which cross had failed and taught him something. Which mare he'd nearly sold in the bad years and was grateful now he hadn't. The particular stubborn arithmetic of good breeding, where a man made 100 small right choices in a row and still had to wait 3-4 years past every single one of them to find out whether he'd been right at all. That's a long time to wait on being right, she said. It is. Most people don't have the patience for waiting that long to find out. Most people, he said, aren't willing to be wrong that long either. If it turns out that way. She asked about the chestnut gelding's shoulder. Next she'd noticed it, out in the pasture, before he'd said a word about it. He's carrying stiff on the left, she said. Hit something in the dark, running from the storm most likely. He'll work it loose. He will. Give him a week. She said it with the same flat certainty she said everything, and he found himself believing her the way you believe a fact rather than an opinion. They talked past what either of them had probably intended, the fire burning low, the wind picking up again outside in a way that made them both go quiet a moment and listen to it, gauging. Storm's turning again, she said. Second one of the season, probably. Feels like it. She looked toward the window, where nothing was visible now but black and the faint gray smear of blown snow catching what little light the house threw. He watched her weigh something, watched her decide. I'll take the barn, she said. No need to trouble you for a room. There's a spare room, he said. Better than a barn in a second storm. I'm not offering out of manners. I'm offering because a barn roof in this territory isn't built to keep a person warm past midnight. And I'd know, having slept in mine more than once out of stubbornness. She looked at him a moment longer than the offer strictly required. Weighing it. Weighing him. Maybe. The whole of him. The way she seemed to weigh most things carefully. Without hurry, without letting her face give away which side of the scale was winning. All right, she said, one night. He showed her to the spare room and noticed, without meaning to make anything of it, the way she set her bag down within easy reach of the door instead of by the bed, the way her eyes moved once, quick, to the window and the latch on it before she said goodnight. He didn't remark on it. It wasn't his to remark on. A person who'd ridden 29 days alone through country that hadn't always been kin to her had earned right to know where the doors were in any room she slept in, and he understood, watching her, that this was simply a thing she carried the way. He carried his own grief quietly, without asking anyone's permission to carry it, and without expecting anyone to notice that she did. She was up before him. He came into the kitchen expecting to build the fire himself and found it already built, the room already warmer than it had any right to be at that hour. The good smell of coffee was already sitting thick in the air, and there was a plate laid out at his place at the table, and for one disoriented moment, standing in the doorway with sleep still heavy behind his eyes, he had the strange floating sensation of having woken into a version of his own life he hadn't inhabited in 15 years, a kitchen that smelled like someone else's cooking, a fire already fought and won before he'd so much as pulled his boots on. He stood there a moment longer than the moment strictly required, letting the feeling pass through him and out the other side, because feelings like that, unexamined too closely, had a way of turning into something a man couldn't easily put back down. Wren was already back from the barn with a report, before he'd even managed to ask for one. Mare's swelling's down some, she said. She's putting weight on it. You were right, she'll hold. You were right, he said. I was hoping. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that he counted it as a small victory of the morning. He didn't get far into his morning before a rider appeared on the north trail, moving at the particular unhurried pace of a man who wanted it. Understood he wasn't in any hurry, which in Amos's experience usually meant the opposite was true. Otis Ferris ran the spread 2 miles north, along with enough opinions about everyone else's business to fill a spread twice the size. Heard you got your horses back, Ferris said, by way of greeting, reining in at the yard fence without troubling himself to dismount, which was its own kind of statement. Whole valley's talking about it. Woman rode in with all 12, they're saying. News travels fast for a valley this size. Always does. Ferris's eyes went past Amos. Toward the house. toward the door where Wren had just stepped out onto the porch, with a dish towel still in her hand, drawn by the sound of a second horse in the yard. His gaze held on her a beat longer than was polite, and something in his expression shifted, not quite a frown, more a recalculation. That her? That's Wren, Amos said. She's the one found them. Apache? The word came out of Ferris flat and careful. The way a man says a word he's already decided has weight to it before he's finished deciding what to do with that weight. Found my horses in a box canyon and rode 12 of them down a mountain trail alone in 2 feet of snow, Amos said. That's what I know for certain. Rest of it's her business. Ferris held his gaze a moment and something passed behind the other man's eyes that Amos didn't much care for, though he couldn't have named it yet. Caution, maybe, or the particular kind of suspicion that doesn't need a reason so much as it needs an excuse, and will take whichever one happens to be standing closest. You want to be careful, Ferris said, having a stranger like that around the place. Territory's not settled on that question, you understand. Soldiers through here, regular, asking after loose parties, and a man harboring. She's not being harbored, Amos said, and heard his own voice go harder than he'd meant it to. She's a guest, same as anybody'd be who rode 12 horses back to a man who'd already given them up for dead. Ferris raised a hand, placating, the gesture of a man who wanted credit for backing off without actually backing off from the thing he'd said. Just looking out for you, Hartwell. Man loses a whole string in a storm. Valley's already asking questions about how a fella keeps a place going alone at your age. Don't need more questions stacked on top of that. The words landed somewhere already tender from 3 sleepless nights. What questions is the Valley asking exactly? Just talk, Ferris said, too quickly, which told Amos it was more than talk. You know how it goes. I know how it goes. I also know a cut fence wire when I find one, Otis, and I found one this morning. I'd take it as a kindness if the Valley spent its talking on that, instead of on who sleeps in my spare room. That landed. He watched it land. Watched Ferris's easy, unbothered posture go very slightly still. Cut, Ferris repeated. You're sure? I'm sure. Ferris was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, some of the performance had gone out of his voice, replaced by something that sounded almost like real unease. Storm's a hard thing to blame a man for. Somebody cutting your wire's a different matter entirely. You want to be careful who you say that to, Hartwell. Word like that gets around a valley just as fast as any other kind. Maybe it ought to. Ferris didn't have an answer for that. He touched his hat, brief, and turned his horse back toward the north trail. Without further comment, and Amos stood watching him go, turning over in his mind everything the man had said, and more, everything he hadn't. Wren had come down off the porch by the time Ferris was out of easy earshot, dish towel still over one shoulder, watching the retreating rider with an expression Amos couldn't quite read. Neighbor? She asked. Something like one. He'll talk. He will. She looked at Amos a moment, weighing something. The way she seemed to weigh most things before letting them out into the open air between them. That going to be trouble for you? Me being here? He thought about giving her the easy answer, decided somewhere in the space of that thought that she'd earned better than easy. Might be, he said. I don't much care. She studied him a moment longer, and whatever she was looking for, she seemed, for the time being, to find it. All right, she said, and picked up the empty water bucket at her feet and went to fill it. And that, for the moment, was the end of the conversation, though Amos suspected, watching her go, that it was very far from the end of the matter. He stood alone in the yard a while after she'd gone, turning Ferris's words over the way he'd turned the cut wire over, looking for the part of it that would let him set it down and stop carrying it. He didn't find that part, because Ferris wasn't wrong about the valley talking. He knew that. He'd lived here 22 years, and he understood, better than he liked to, how a small place kept its accounts on a man, quiet and constant, the way Ruth used to keep the ranch ledger, except nobody in town wrote it down where you could see it and argue the figures. They just knew. Man loses his horses once, that's misfortune. Man loses them twice in a lifetime, that starts to look, to a valley with nothing better to do than watch its neighbors, like a pattern, with his name signed at the bottom of it. And now there'd be a woman added to the account too. He understood that as plainly as he understood anything. Wren, Apache, staying under his roof, and every word Ferris carried back to the Denby place, and the feed store, and the little church on the West Road would come with its own interest attached, growing the way debts grow when a man isn't looking. He found, standing there in the cold with the bucket handle creaking somewhere behind him, where Wren worked the pump, that he minded less than he probably should have, which was its own kind of strength. 15 years he'd measured a good portion of his worth by what the valley thought of him, because there hadn't been anyone left, After Ruth, whose opinion he trusted more than the general uneasy consensus of people who mostly didn't know him, and now, one day into knowing a stranger who'd ridden his horses down off a mountain, that measurement had started to feel like it belonged to somebody else's life. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. Some things a man learns are better let alone until they're ready to be looked at square. He went out to check the stock himself while she started something with the flour. He'd shown her the location of, and it was out there, at the south pasture gate, doing the ordinary work of counting his good fortunes one more time, because he still hadn't entirely trusted it to evaporate overnight. That he found the thing that changed the shape of everything that came after. The gatepost nearest the wash, the wire that ran from it toward the corner brace. It wasn't torn. It wasn't snapped the ragged way wire snaps when a frightened animal drives through it in a panic, or the way it frays and finally gives after years of weather working at it link by link. It was cut, clean, a single deliberate stroke through 3 strands of wire, close enough to the post that a careless eye passing at any speed would take the gap for storm damage and think no more about it. He stood there a long moment with his hand on the cold wire, turning the fact of it over, and the turning didn't change what it was, no matter how many times he ran it through his mind. Because a blizzard doesn't cut wire. Wind doesn't reach for a tool and make one clean pass through 3 strands and then leave. Snow doesn't decide where a gate ought to fail. A person does that. He thought of the 3 days he'd spent riding every draw and gully between here and the Sulphur Fork, thinking the storm alone had done this to him, thinking the arithmetic of bad luck had simply landed on him twice in 15 years the way it does on a man for no reason at all, except that reasons aren't owed to anybody, except the wire told a different story than the one he'd been telling himself, and a man doesn't like discovering, 3 days into his grief, that the grief might have had a hand behind it he hadn't thought to look for. He crouched there a while longer, turning the wire over in his gloved hand like it might tell him something more if he just looked at it long enough. Which was foolish. Wire doesn't hold a story past the one plain fact of itself. Cut clean, cut deliberate. Cut by somebody who'd stood at this exact gate, maybe in daylight, maybe with all the time in the world, and made a choice. Because that's what it was. Not whether, a choice. Until he made himself stop crouching there and stand, because a man can only stare at a piece of cut wire so long before staring at it stops being useful and starts being something closer to hiding. He thought about the 3 days he'd spent riding, calling names into wind that swallowed them whole, believing the whole while that the only thing he was fighting was weather. Except he hadn't been. He'd been fighting weather and something else entirely, something with hands and a blade and a reason he didn't yet understand. He'd spent 3 days not knowing it, which left him standing there in the cold with his fingers going numb around a piece of severed wire, feeling less like a man who'd been unlucky and more like a man who'd been made a fool of. He didn't say anything to Wren about it right away. He went back inside and ate the biscuits she'd made, which were good, better than anything he'd made himself in longer than he wanted to admit, and he said the things a person says over a meal, and the whole time some part of his mind stayed out at that gate, turning the cut wire over and over like a stone he couldn't put down. It was Wren who noticed first that he wasn't fully in the room with her. "Something's sitting wrong with you," she said. Not a question. A statement, the way she said most things laid flat on the table between them like a card turned face up. He looked at her, considered the way he suspected she'd been considering things with him since the moment she rode into his yard, how much of a door to open. "Come with me," he said instead. "I want you to look at something." She crouched by the cut wire the same way she'd crouched by the mule's forelegs the day before. Methodical, unhurried, running her fingers along the severed ends without quite touching them, studying the angle of the cut the way another person might study a signature to judge whether it had been forged. "Clean cut," she said, "one pass. Sharp blade and somebody who knew where to make it so it'd read like storm damage to anybody not looking close. Could a rock have done it? Ice working at it? Ice doesn't leave an edge like that." She stood brushing snow from her knees. This was a hand, and it was done before the storm hit, not after, or the cut ends would show more weather on them than they do. He felt something settle in his chest, heavy and cold, colder than the morning around them. "Somebody opened this gate on purpose," he said, "before the storm ever came. Somebody made sure it opened," she said, "whether the storm came or not. Storm just did the rest of the work for them." He looked out past the gate toward the ridgeline, toward the canyon where she'd found his horses, wedged and freezing, and 3 days from dying of exposure and neglect in country that owed them nothing. "Who'd want to do a thing like that to me?" he said, and it wasn't really a question, more a thing said out loud because saying it out loud was the only way he knew to start making sense of it. Wren didn't answer that, not yet. She was looking past him, past the gate, up toward the low rise where the trail bent toward the canyon mouth. Her eyes narrowed against the light in a way that told him she'd seen something he hadn't. "There's something up there," she said. "By the canyon entrance. Wasn't there when I brought the horses through yesterday, or I'd have marked it." "What is it?" "Can't tell from here." "Get your horse." They rode up together, the mule keeping easy pace with his gelding, despite the animal's homely build, and the whole ride up Amos found himself watching Wren instead of the trail, the way she read the ground without seeming to try, the small corrections she made without looking down, avoiding a loose shale patch here, a frost heave there, the way a person moves through a room they've lived in their whole life, instead of country they'd first laid eyes on 24 hours before. The trail climbed hard through a stand of pinon, gone silver, green under a fresh dusting of overnight snow, the air up here thinner and colder than it had been in the yard, sharp enough in the lungs that Amos found himself breathing through his teeth without meaning to. Below and behind them, the ranch shrank to something small and fragile-looking, the house and barn no bigger than a child's toys set down carelessly in the wide gray sweep of the valley. And it struck him, not for the first time but harder than usual, how little a man's whole life amounted to when you looked back at it from high enough ground. 2 buildings, a scatter of fence, 12 animals grazing in a pasture no wider from this height than the width of his own hand held out at arm's length. The wind came steadier the higher they climbed, carrying with it the mineral smell of wet rock, and the fainter, sweeter smell of snow, beginning to melt where the morning sun had found it. Somewhere above them a hawk turned a long, slow circle against the pale sky, riding a current neither of them could feel from the ground, and Wren's eyes tracked it a moment before returning, unhurried, to the trail. At the canyon mouth, she reined in and dismounted before he'd fully stopped, and crouched beside a stand of scrub brush at the trail's edge. A stake, driven into the frozen ground, new enough that the wood hadn't yet weathered to match the gray of everything around it. A strip of cloth tied near its top, the kind surveyors used to mark a line, faded red going to pink from however many days it had already spent out here in the sun and the snow. "Survey marker," Amos said, crouching beside her, turning it over in his gloved hand once he'd worked it loose from the frozen dirt. "There's more," Wren said. She was already moving, following a line only she seemed able to see, and 30 yards on she stopped at a second one, and past that, visible now that he knew to look, a third, marching in a straight deliberate line along the ridge that overlooked his upper pasture and, he realized with a slow cold understanding, the water that fed it. "Somebody's been surveying my land," he said. "Somebody's been surveying the water," Wren said. "Look where the line runs. It doesn't follow your fence." He looked. She was right. The stakes didn't care about his property markers at all. They cared about the creek, about the spring that fed his upper pasture, and half the grazing land in the valley below it, tracing its course the way a man traces a thing he means to own. Wren was quiet a long moment, still holding the strip of faded cloth, and when she spoke again her voice had gone lower, flatter, the particular flatness he was starting to understand. She used when a thing mattered more than she wanted it to show. "I've seen stakes like these before," she said. "Different ground, different water, same line." He looked at her. "You've seen this exact thing happen somewhere else. I've seen men walk land that wasn't theirs yet, marking the parts worth having, before they ever brought the paper meant to make it theirs. Seen it done to grazing ground my own people, held longer than this territory's had a name for it. The stakes go in quiet, nobody asks. By the time anybody thinks to ask, there's already a line drawn, and lines, once they're drawn, have a way of getting treated like they were always there." He didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't a right thing to say, and he understood enough, standing there, to know that reaching for a wrong one would cost him more than staying quiet would. "That what happened to you," he said finally. "Where you're from." "That's part of what happened," she said. "Wasn't the whole of it. Doesn't need to be, for you to understand the shape of what you're looking at right now." She held the strip of cloth out to him, and he took it, and she watched him take it with an expression hard to place, something between warning and plain fact. "Somebody's decided your water's worth more than your say over it. That's not a new kind of wanting, Amos Hartwell. It's a very old one. It's just new to you. I always figured a man's deed meant something. It means something right up until somebody with more money and less patience decides it doesn't," she said. "Then it means exactly as much as you're willing to fight for it, meaning." He looked at her, really looked, in a way he hadn't quite let himself yet, and saw something there he recognized. because he'd been wearing a version of it himself for 15 years. Not softness, not bitterness either, not quite. Something harder one than either of those. A clear-eyed refusal to be surprised twice by the same shape of unfairness. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what was done to you, whatever it was exactly." She looked at him a moment, and something in her face eased. Just slightly, the way frozen ground gives. Not all at once, enough that you notice. Most people don't say that without asking me first to explain myself into deserving it. I don't need explaining to know a wrong was done. "No," she said quiet. "I don't suppose you do." He turned the stake over, once more in his hand, looking for a name, a mark, anything. There was nothing. No company name burned into the wood, no initials carved anywhere he could find. Whoever had driven these into his ground had been careful enough, or arrogant enough, to leave nothing behind that could be traced back to a face. But somebody had walked this ridge. Somebody had stood right here, above his upper pasture, planning something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with what his land was worth to a person who didn't care whose name was on the deed. And 3 days later, 12 horses had gone missing through a gate that hadn't opened itself. He looked out over his own pasture, at the 12 horses grazing easy in the cold morning light, alive, because a woman he'd met less than a day before had happened to be riding through country that had no earthly reason to have her in it, and he felt the whole shape of the last 3 days shift under him like ground giving way. This wasn't the storm, he said quietly. Or it wasn't straightened beside him, still holding the strip of faded cloth she'd untied from the second stake, turning it slowly between her fingers. "No," she said. "I don't believe it was." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The wind moved through the canyon below them, carrying up the small ordinary sounds of his horses grazing, unbothered, unaware that the ground they stood on had just become a great deal more complicated than either of them had understood it to be 24 hours before. Amos Hartwell looked down at the survey stake in his hand, and then out at his herd, and then, finally, at the woman standing beside him who had ridden 29 days through country that killed careless people, and who had, without knowing it, walked straight into the middle of something he did not yet understand and could not yet name. "Whoever did this," he said, "isn't finished." Wren looked at him. There was nothing soft in her expression, nothing that pretended the morning had turned out to be anything other than what it plainly was. Just that same flat, clear-eyed steadiness he'd noticed in her from the first moment she'd asked him a simple 2-word question across his own yard. "Then you'd best find out who they are," she said, "before they finish it." He nodded slowly, and together they turned their animals back down the ridge, toward the ranch, toward the 12 horses grazing below them in the cold, clean light. 12 horses that had been meant, he now understood with a certainty that settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, never to come home at all. The ride down from the ridge was quieter than the ride up had been, both of them carrying now the weight of what they'd found. And Amos found himself watching the country differently than he had that morning. Not as the familiar shape of a life he'd built, but as ground somebody else had already started measuring for a different purpose entirely. The pasture that had always simply been his pasture. The wash that had always simply been his water. He wondered how long the stakes had sat up there before Wren's eye had caught them. How many mornings he'd ridden past that exact stretch of ridge without once looking up to see what was being planned above his own herd. By the time they'd turned the horses out to graze, in the last of the afternoon light, the sky to the west had gone the particular flat gray that meant the second storm Wren had smelled coming. The night before was no longer a matter of if. "You'll want to get moving," Amos said, standing at the yard fence, watching the color drain out of the horizon in a way that told him they had hours, not days. "Before that closes the pass behind you." Wren stood beside him a moment, not answering right away, her eyes on the same gray sky, doing whatever calculation she did with weather, the way other people did arithmetic with numbers. "I could," she said, but there's a man laying on this land who cuts wire in the dark and drives stakes into frozen ground and doesn't leave his name on either one. And there's a woman 29 days from anywhere who's got no particular reason to be anywhere else by any particular hour." She turned to look at him. "I've got a mule that could use a day's rest before another hard push through the pass. That's reason enough, if you're asking. I wasn't asking you to stay on my account. I know you weren't." Something in the way she said it, plain and unhurried, told him she meant exactly what she'd said, and not one thing more. And he found, standing there with the light going and the wind starting to pick up out of the west, that he was grateful for that plainness in a way he didn't have easy words for. "There's a spare room," he said. "Same terms as last night." "Same terms," she agreed. They went in ahead of the weather, and that night, over a meal better than the one before it, because she'd found the good coffee he'd been hoarding since fall. He told her what he hadn't told anyone in the valley yet, because he hadn't fully let himself believe it until he'd said it out loud to somebody willing to hear it plain. "I don't know who did this," he said. "Cutting the wire, the stakes, any of it. I've got the beginnings of a guess, and I don't like where it points. But a guess isn't proof, and I've built this place too carefully to go accusing a man on nothing but a guess." "Then you'll need more than a guess," Wren said. "I will. I know this ground now," she said. "Better than most who've ridden it a year. I can read what's written on it plainer than most men can read a ledger. If somebody's out there planning to take more from you than 12 horses, they'll leave more sign doing it. Men who move careful once get careless the second time, when they think the first time went unnoticed." He looked at her across the table, at the steady certainty in her face, the same certainty that had ridden 12 horses down a mountain trail and pulled a mare's leg free of a rock crack and driven 29 days through country that had every reason to kill her and hadn't managed it. "You'd help me with that," he said. "Knowing what it might cost you, staying around a place that's already drawing the kind of attention mine started drawing." "I've spent most of my life around places drawing that kind of attention," she said. "Least this once. I'd be standing on the side of somebody trying to keep what's his, instead of somebody trying to take it." She met his eyes, steady, unflinching, the way she'd met them from the very first moment in the yard. "Besides, you gave a stranger a spare room and didn't once ask her to explain herself into deserving it. I generally find that worth something." Outside, the wind found the eaves and began, in earnest, to howl, and the first hard gusts of the second storm drove snow rattling against the window glass, and neither of them moved to check it, because there was nothing out there tonight that needed saving. Not this time, not yet. Amos Hartwell sat at his own kitchen table, across from a woman he'd known less than 2 full days, and felt something in his chest he hadn't let himself feel in longer than he could accurately measure. Not hope, exactly. Hope had always struck him as something too soft-edged for a man his age to trust. This was harder than hope, steadier, something closer to purpose. Outside, the storm closed over the ranch the way the first one had, indifferent, enormous, uncaring of the 12 horses safe now in the barn, or of the 2 people sitting up late at a kitchen table with a length of survey marker cloth laid out flat between them like evidence at a trial neither of them had yet found a courtroom for. Before he banked the fire for the night, he did a thing he hadn't done in longer than he could rightly say. He took down the old ranch ledger from the shelf above the desk, the one Ruth used to keep, the one he'd left mostly untouched these last years, because opening it always felt like opening a door into a room he wasn't ready to stand in. He set it on the table under the lamp, and he found a clean page, and he wrote, in a hand nowhere near as steady or as sure as hers had been, the date, and beneath it, 12 horses returned. Sound, 1 mare, leg healing. Cut, not weather. Stakes found, ridge above upper pasture, waterline marked. He looked at the words a long while after he'd written them. Plain facts, laid down flat, the way Ruth would have laid them down. Not the whole truth of the last 2 days, which had more feeling folded into it than any ledger could hold, but the bones of the truth, the part a man could return to later and trust, when memory started softening the hard edges, the way memory always did given enough time. He thought, closing the book, that she would have approved of this much at least. Not the trouble, she'd never have approved of the trouble, but the plain accounting of it, the refusal to let a thing go unrecorded just because it was frightening to look at directly. That much, he thought, she'd have recognized as hers. He banked the fire, he checked the window latch out of habit more than need, and he went to bed in a house that for the first time in 15 years did not feel entirely like his to carry alone. This time, Amos Hartwell was not sitting alone, and this time, when morning came, he intended to be riding out to find not what the storm had taken, but who. Arizona Territory, 1,865. The second storm burned itself out sometime before dawn, the way storms in that country generally did, all at once, like a man who has been shouting too long and simply runs out of breath to keep doing it. Amos woke to a silence so complete it had its own weight. He lay there a moment in the gray half-light, listening to nothing, and it took him longer than it should have to remember why the nothing felt different this time than it had 3 mornings before, because 3 mornings before, the nothing had meant loss. This time, it meant only that the wind had stopped. He lay a while longer than he needed to, staring up at the low beam where Ruth used to hang the dried chilies, and found himself, for once, not thinking about her absence so much as the strange new fact, sitting downstairs in his spare room. A woman he'd known 2 days now. 2 days, and already the house had started arranging itself around a second person's habits, the way it hadn't in 15 years, the particular creak of a floorboard she avoided without seeming to think about it, the way the coffee tin had migrated 3 inches to the left, because that was where her hand reached first, each morning. He didn't examine that too closely either. Man simply gets up and lets the day be whatever it's going to be, without asking it to explain itself first. He got up. He built the fire before he remembered Wren might already have built it, and found, stepping into the kitchen, that she had. Of course she had. He was starting to understand that about her. She rose before the day asked her to, and she left a room better than she'd found it. And she did both without comment, as if comment were a currency she'd decided long ago not to spend carelessly. Horses came through it fine, she said, not looking up from the pan she was working. Sorrel's leg is near sound. Another day, maybe two, you were out there already. Couldn't sleep past first light. Never could in weather like that. You keep listening for what it's going to take next. She said it plain, the way she said most things, but something in it caught him anyway, because he understood exactly what she meant, and he suspected she knew he'd understand it, and had said it to him for that reason and no other. He sat, she set a plate down, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, which by now had stopped feeling like the awkward kind of quiet, and started feeling like the other kind, the kind two people build together when they've decided, without discussing it, that they don't need to fill every space between them with talk. It was Wren who broke it. You said last night you had the ledger, she said. Show me. He hadn't expected that. He said as much. You expected what then? I don't rightly know. Didn't expect a woman I met 2 days ago to ask after my accounts before breakfast was finished. I asked because you're going to need money to fight whoever did this, she said. And I've yet to meet a man who can fight anything properly while he's also losing at the thing he's fighting to protect. Show me the books. I kept ledgers 7 years for people who trusted me with worse secrets than yours. He didn't ask what those secrets had been. He was learning the shape of her doors by now, which ones opened easy and which ones didn't, and this felt like one that wasn't going to open this morning regardless of how he knocked. He brought the ledger down, not Ruth's old book, the one he'd written in. The night before a different one, the working one, the numbers of the last 3 years laid out in his own cramped hand, uneven where Ruth's had been straight, honest where it could afford to be, and hopeful where it couldn't. Wren sat with it a long while, didn't rush, turned pages slow, tracing columns with one finger, occasionally marking a corner with a small fold that made him wince a little each time, because it was a fine ledger, and he'd never once folded a page in it himself, out of some half-formed respect for the paper, but he let her do it, because whatever she was doing with those small folded corners was clearly not carelessness, it was a system. And a person only builds a system for a thing they intend to come back to. You're underselling, she said finally. Come again? Your breeding fees here? She turned the book to face him, tapped a column. Compared to what the Denby place charges for comparable stock, you're near a fifth under. Have been for 3 years running by the look of these entries. Denby's got the name in this valley. I don't. Denby's got the name because people pay Denby's price and assume the price means the quality, she said. You've got better bloodlines sitting in that pasture right now than anything on the Denby place, and you're charging like you don't believe it yourself. He didn't have a ready answer for that. He'd never once, in 11 years, sat down and compared his own figures against the neighbors, because comparing it always felt too much like asking to be told he wasn't good enough, and there'd been enough of that feeling already, without going looking for more of it in a ledger. And here, she flipped forward, feed. You're buying from the mill in town at the town price. There's a grain operation 2 valleys south sells direct, cheaper by enough that it'd matter across a full year if you contracted with them instead. I didn't know that. Most men don't until somebody sits down and adds the numbers instead of just living inside them. She closed the book, gentle. The way you close something you've decided has earned a little care. This place isn't failing, Amos Hartwell. It's being run by a man too busy surviving it to step back far enough to see what it actually is. He looked at her across the table, and something in his chest did the thing it kept doing around her, a kind of loosening he hadn't asked for, and didn't entirely know how to carry yet. That's near enough what my wife used to tell me, he said, about surviving a thing instead of running it. She sounds like she saw clearly. She did. He turned his cup slowly on the table, watching the coffee ring it left, not quite ready to look up. There was a stretch, years back, before you'd have known me at all, when I sold this place down to almost nothing. 2 studs, that was the whole of it. And I remember Ruth sitting exactly where you're sitting now, going through numbers just like these, and she never once raised her voice about any of it. Just laid the truth down flat and let me decide what to do with it. What did you decide? Built it back. Took years. Took longer than I wanted it to, and there were nights I wasn't sure it'd take it all. He looked up, finally, and found her watching him with an attention that felt, for a moment, uncomfortably close to being seen all the way through. I suppose that's why finding these horses gone felt the way it did. Wasn't just 12 animals. Felt like the whole climb back up the mountain. Happening again, except this time I wasn't sure I had another climb left in me. You had one, Ren said. You just needed somebody riding up the trail behind you to prove it. Good, Ren said, and there was something almost gentle under the flatness of it. Means you already know how to listen to somebody telling you the hard truth. That'll save us both some time. They were 3 days into this new rhythm, mornings on the ledger, afternoons riding the fence line looking for more cut wire, more stakes, more sign of a hand that didn't want to be seen, and the fence held nothing new, which should have been a comfort, and somehow wasn't, because a silence after a first strike has a way of feeling less like safety and more like a held breath. Amos found himself, those 3 days, doing something he hadn't done in years, which was noticing the ranch again instead of simply enduring it. The particular blue the mountains went at dusk. The sound the wind made coming down off the high country, different in pitch than the wind that came up from the valley floor, a thing he'd known without knowing he knew it, until Wren pointed it out one evening, unprompted, the way she seemed to notice everything the land was telling her whether she'd asked it to or not. You hear that? She'd said, on the second evening, both of them leaning on the corral rail, watching the last light go copper over the ridge. That's a wind that's going to bring more weather in a week, maybe less. How do you know that, and not just it's windy? Same way you know a horse is going lame before it's limping proper. You've watched enough of them do it, that your body knows before your mind's caught up. She hadn't looked at him when she said it, kept her eyes on the ridge instead, but he'd felt the small warmth of being included in a knowing she didn't extend easily to just anyone. It was on the third morning, with that promised weather still a week off, and nothing new to report on the wire, that the rider came up the north trail at a pace that told Amos, before he'd even made out the face under the hat, that this one wasn't Otis Ferris. Because Ferris rode unhurried on purpose, to make a point of not hurrying. This rider came at an easy, unbothered trot that wasn't performing anything at all, which was in its own way worse. A man secure enough in his welcome that he didn't feel the need to perform arriving at all. Company, Wren said, low, from where she stood at the paddock rail. She didn't move toward the house. Amos noticed that, noted the careful, deliberate way she stayed exactly where she was, neither hiding nor announcing herself, simply present, the way a person stands when they've learned that the safest place in a room is often the place nobody's told you to occupy. The rider drew up at the yard fence and dismounted without being asked, which Amos also noted, filed away next to everything else. He was starting to file away about how this particular morning was going to go. Silas Cobb was not a large man. That surprised Amos every time he encountered him, because everything about Cobb's manner suggested again twice his actual size, the deliberate slowness of his movements, the way he let a silence sit a beat longer than it needed to before he filled it, the particular quality of his attention when it landed on you, like a hand settling on your shoulder that hadn't quite decided yet whether it meant to steady you or hold you in place. He'd come to the territory 8 years back, with money nobody quite understood the source of, and he'd spent every one of those 8 years turning that money into land, water, and the particular quiet leverage that comes from being the one man in a valley who can make a struggling neighbor's problems disappear for a price the neighbor generally didn't fully understand until it was too late to refuse paying it. Amos had watched it happen to 2 other ranches in the years since, watched good land change hands not through any single dramatic theft, but through a slow accumulation of debts and favors in generous terms, until one morning the man who'd owned the place simply didn't anymore, and Cobb's brand was on the gate instead. He had never once in 8 years ridden up Amos's own trail before this morning. Hartwell. Cobb touched his hat. His eyes moved past Amos, to Wren at the paddock rail, and held there a beat, and then moved on. Unhurried, the way a man's eyes move over an inventory he's already decided he understands the value of. And your guest. Word travels. Word usually does around here. I heard about the horses. Cobb's voice carried the particular warmth of a man who has practiced sounding warm for so long he's nearly forgotten the practicing. Terrible thing. A man losing his whole string like that. I said as much to my wife. Said there's a fellow who's had more than his share of hard luck over the years, and it doesn't seem right, does it? That hard luck should keep finding the same door. I got them back, Amos said, all 12. Sound so I heard. A blessing. Something flickered behind Cobb's eyes. There and gone too fast for Amos to name it with any certainty, though he'd think about it later. Turn it over the way he'd turned over the cut wire, and wonder if what he'd seen was disappointment. Still, a close call like that has a way of reminding a man how thin the margins are out here, how quick a whole life's work can turn to nothing, given the wrong week of weather. It reminded me of that. Yes, I've come with a proposal then. In that spirit, Cobb reached into his coat, unhurried, and produced a folded paper, holding it out not quite far enough for Amos to take it without stepping closer. A small, deliberate calculation Amos recognized for what it was only after he'd already taken the step. Alone, generous terms. Enough to see you through a lean season, rebuild what needs rebuilding, put something aside against the next storm, because there'll be a next storm. Hartwell, there's always a next storm in this country. Amos took the paper, didn't open it yet. Why would you offer me a loan, Cobb? We've done business exactly twice in 8 years, and neither time was friendly. Because I'm a practical man. And practical men understand that a struggling neighbor is a liability to everyone around him. Cobb smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. A ranch fails, Hartwell. It doesn't fail quiet, it fails loud. Debts unpaid. Land sold at auction to whoever's standing closest with cash in hand. Better for everyone, myself included, if that doesn't happen to yours. Better for you, especially, seems like. I won't pretend there's no self-interest in it. I've never once pretended that with you, and I'm not about to start. Cobb's eyes went, again, unhurried, toward Wren, who hadn't moved from the paddock rail, who was watching this entire exchange with the same flat, unreadable attention she seemed to bring to everything. Though I'll admit, some of my neighbors might find your current arrangements here worth a conversation of their own. A man in your position, Hartwell reputation matters more than usual right now. Wouldn't you agree? Debs have a way of getting called in faster on a man the Valley's already talking about. There it was. Not a threat. Cobb would never say a threat plain. Amos understood that now, watching the man's face, the careful, pleasant blankness of it. Cobb dealt in the suggestion of a threat, the shape of one left standing just visible enough that a man could see it without Cobb ever having put it there. I'll read the terms, Amos said, and I'll get back to you. Take your time. Cobb didn't move toward his horse yet. He stood a moment longer, looking past Amos, out at the pasture, at the 12 animals grazing there, and something in his face, for just a moment, shed the careful pleasantness he'd been wearing since he rode in. Fine string you've built. 11 years, I understand. That's a long time to pour into a piece of ground that could turn on you in a single bad week. Same as it very nearly did. It didn't turn on me. It was turned on me. There's a difference, and I expect you know it better than most. Cobb's eyes came back to him, sharp now, all the warmth gone out of them at once, like a lamp turned down. That's a curious thing to suggest, Hartwell. Wasn't suggesting anything. Was stating a fact I found with my own 2 hands. Wire doesn't cut itself. For a long moment neither man said anything, and the silence between them carried more weight than either the fence or the horses or the paper in Amos's hand, because it was, without either of them saying so plainly, the moment the whole shape of the thing became visible to both of them at once. Wire fails in storms, Cobb said finally. Careful now, each word chosen the way a man chooses his footing on ice. Happens more often than you'd think, in country like this. Does it? It does. Cobb's smile came back, thinner now, more of a warning than a welcome. I'd be careful, Hartwell, about the kind of accusations a man makes out loud in a valley this small. Accusations have a way of costing the accuser more than the accused, when there's no proof standing behind them. Something to consider before you go repeating what you just said to me to anyone else.
That a threat, Cobb?
That's advice, from a neighbor. Cobb touched his hat again, unbothered, already turning back toward his horse, though I wouldn't take too much of it. Offers like this don't stay generous forever, and neither, I find, does a valley's patience. He mounted and rode back the way he'd come, unhurried, and Amos stood in the yard, holding a folded paper that felt, in his hand, considerably heavier than its weight in actual paper had any right to be. Don't sign it, Wren said, before he'd even finished crossing the yard back to her. Haven't read it yet. Don't need to read it to know what it is. Man like that doesn't offer a rope to a drowning neighbor out of the goodness in him. He offers a rope with a hook on the end of it, and he waits for you to be desperate enough not to check for the hook before you grab hold. Amos unfolded the paper anyway, standing right there at the rail, and read it through once. Slow, the way Ruth had taught him to read anything with numbers in it twice. At minimum, because the first read tells you what a document wants you to see, and the second read tells you what it's actually saying. The second read told him plenty. Generous terms, Cobb had called it. Generous, if you didn't look too closely at the clause buried 3 paragraphs down, the one that put up not the horses, not the equipment, but the land itself, all of it, the water rights included as collateral against a debt, structured to call due in full the moment any single payment came in, late by so much as a week. He wants the water, Amos said quietly. Same as the stakes on the ridge told us. This is the same wanting, wearing a different coat. Most wanting does, given enough time and enough money behind it. Wren took the paper from him. Read it herself, her eyes moving fast down the page, in a way that told him she'd read documents like this before. In some other life, she still wasn't ready to describe to him in full. This isn't a loan, Amos Hartwell. This is a trap built to look generous right up until the day it isn't. I know it, you going to sign it anyway. He looked at her, looked past her, at the 12 horses grazing easy in the afternoon light, at the barn, at the house where Ruth's ledger still sat open on the kitchen table, with a hand-drawn line under 3 figures that were, for the first time in years, starting to look like they might add up to something worth having. No, he said, I'm not signing it. Good, Renson said, because I don't believe he expected you to. Not really. I believe he came out here mostly to see how you'd react when he named what he had on you, and now he knows. Something cold moved through Amos at that, colder than the wind that had carried Cobb up the trail and away again. What's that mean for us? Wren was quiet a moment, folding the paper back along its original creases with a care that seemed to Amos almost ceremonial, the way a person folds something they intend to keep as evidence rather than discard as trash. Means he'll come at it a different way now, she said. Men like that don't stop wanting a thing just because the front door's been shut on them. They go looking for a side window instead. Amos sat down heavy on the porch step, the same step he'd been sitting on the morning. This all started, and found himself, for a moment, back in that particular arithmetic he'd been running before the sound of hooves interrupted it. 43 years old, a ranch that might yet fail regardless of what he did, because a man with enough money would always find a way to make a failure. It happened to somebody who didn't have as much of it. I could take the loan, he said quiet, not quite believing he was saying it out loud. Sign it, buy myself time to prove what he did, and worry about the water rights after you could. Wren sat down beside him unhurried, the way she did most things. But a man who'll drive 12 horses into a blizzard to get at your water isn't a man who'll wait patient while you gather proof against him with his own signature already on your deed. Sign that paper, and the moment anything goes wrong, a late payment, a bad season, anything at all, he owns this ranch clean and legal, and there's no proof in the world that undoes a signature freely given. I know it. Then you already know what you're going to do. You're just scared of doing it. He looked at her, sharp, and found no unkindness in her face, only the same plain, unflinching honesty she'd been offering him since the morning she rode into his yard. That obvious. Fear generally is to somebody who spent her life learning to read it in other people before it gets a chance to read them first. She looked out at the pasture, at the horses, at the whole shape of the life he'd built and was now fighting again to keep. You built this back once already, from 2 studs and a debt that could have buried you. You didn't do that by taking the easy rope somebody handed you. You did it slow and stubborn and mostly alone. I don't believe that man's changed since. He's not alone this time, Amos said, before he'd quite decided to say it. Something moved across her face, brief, unguarded, gone before he could be certain he'd seen it at all. No, she said, he's not. Amos sent his answer on Cobb's loan back the following morning, written plain on a single sheet, no more words in it than the matter required. Not interested. That was the whole of it. He'd considered writing more, considered laying out his suspicions in black ink where Cobb would have to read them, and Wren had talked him out of that too. Give him nothing yet, she'd said. A man who thinks he's still unseen makes mistakes a careful man doesn't. The moment he knows you're watching close, he starts covering his tracks better than he has been. So the note went out short, and word of its shortness, Amos understood, would travel back to Cobb faster than any longer explanation could have. Because a flat no from a man everyone assumed would be desperate enough to take anything offered was its own kind of message, and messages like that didn't stay quiet in a valley this size. The side window, as it turned out, took the shape of a trip into town 3 days later, a trip Amos had been putting off and could no longer afford to keep putting off. because the flour was gone and the coffee was near gone, and a man couldn't run a ranch or fight for one on nothing but stubbornness and cold biscuits. He asked Wren if she wanted to stay behind. He asked it careful, not wanting the question to land wrong, not wanting her to hear in it anything close to what Ferris had implied, that her presence in town was a liability to be managed rather than a person's simple right to go where she pleased. "I'll come," she said. "I've been in that town exactly once passing through, and I'd rather see it plain in daylight with you beside me than let my imagination build it worse than it likely is." It was, as it turned out, roughly as bad as her imagination had likely already built it. They rode in together under a sky gone hard and blue after the second storm's passing, the kind of sharp, clean cold that made every sound carry further than it should. Every hoofbeat and creaking wagon wheel announcing itself to the whole street the moment it turned the corner. Larkin's Crossing wasn't much of a town, a feed store, a church with a bell. Nobody had gotten around to hanging yet, a scatter of houses, a saloon that did more of the valley's real business than the church did, if a man was being honest about it. The feed merchant, a narrow, careful man named Cutler who'd sold Amos his stock for going on 15 years, was polite. That was the word Amos would use later, turning the visit over in his mind on the ride home. Polite, in the particular way that told you politeness had become a wall rather than a welcome. "Hartwell," Cutler nodded, weighing out the flour with more attention to the scale than the transaction strictly required. "Glad to hear you got your horses back." "Obliged." Cutler's eyes went once to Wren, standing a little apart near the door, and then away, quick, the way a man's eyes move off something he's decided not to have an opinion about out loud. "That'll be it." "Then," Cutler said, sliding the sack across the counter, and something in the brevity of it, the absence of the usual weather talk and gossip, that generally stretched a simple purchase into a quarter hour of a man's morning, told Amos more clearly than any words could have exactly how far the valley's talk had already traveled ahead of him. Outside, it was worse. Denby himself was on the street, the neighbor whose ranch had gone 2 years without buying so much as a single colt from Amos's string, and he crossed to the other side rather than pass close, a small deliberate widening of distance that would have looked, to anyone not paying attention, like a man simply choosing a sunnier patch of walkway. Amos was paying attention. He saw it for what it was, and there was worse than Denby. A man Amos recognized from 3 counties over, a buyer named Osric who'd sent word back in the fall that he intended to come look at the bay stud colt come spring, with real money behind the interest, stood outside the saloon in conversation with 2 other men, and when he caught sight of Amos and Wren coming up the street, he found something suddenly urgent to attend to inside, disappearing through the saloon door before Amos had drawn close enough to so much as offer a greeting. Amos stood a moment considering whether to follow, whether a man had any right at all to chase down a buyer and demand an explanation for a courtesy withheld. He decided, in the end, that he did have that right, and crossed the street, and found Osric at the bar not 2 minutes later, nursing a drink he plainly hadn't wanted badly enough to justify the sudden urgency of getting to it. "Osric." The man turned, and something in his face did the particular flinching dance of a person caught doing exactly what he'd hoped not to be caught doing. "Hartwell. Didn't see you there. You saw me plain enough on the street a minute ago." Osric had the decency, at least, not to insult him further by denying it outright. He looked down at his glass instead, turned it once on the bar, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped, apologetic in a way that made the apology worse rather than better, because it meant he knew exactly what he was doing, and had decided to do it regardless. "I heard some things this week," Osric said, "about your situation, about who's staying out at your place. That colt's the same colt he was in the fall, Osric. Same bloodline, same price we discussed." "I don't doubt it." Osric wouldn't meet his eyes now. "But I've got my own reputation to think of, dealing out here regular. Man's got to be careful who he's seen doing business with, this time in the territory, with things as unsettled as they are." He set a few coins on the bar, more than the drink was worth, and stood. "No offense meant, Hartwell. Truly, it's just business. It's just business." Amos repeated, and the words tasted like something gone sour in his mouth, because he understood, watching Osric leave without once looking back, that this was the shape ruin actually took in a place like this. Not one dramatic blow. 100 small withdrawals, each one wearing the perfectly reasonable coat of just business, until a man looked up one day and found there was no business left being done with him at all. He came back outside to find Wren waiting near the horses, having watched the whole exchange through the saloon window without following him in. "Wanted," she said, quiet. Past tense, by the look of him leaving that fast, because that's what it was. Not a coincidence. Not a man simply remembering pressing business at exactly the moment his path crossed theirs. A choice made plain and fast, the choice of a buyer who decided a horse wasn't worth the trouble of being seen doing business with the rancher currently providing the valley's gossip with fresh material. Amos stood in the street a moment, the flour sack heavy on his shoulder, and felt something in him go very still and very cold, the particular stillness of a man watching, in real time, the slow arithmetic of his own ruin being worked out by people who'd never once bothered to ask him a single honest question about any of it. Mr. Hartwell. The voice came from behind him, unhurried, kind in a way that startled him after the last quarter hour. He turned to find the Reverend Talmage, a thin, stooped man with more patience in his face than the town around him generally seemed to deserve, standing with his hat already off, the way he greeted everyone regardless of the weather or the season or, apparently, the valley's current opinion of who deserved greeting. Reverend, I heard about your horses. A blessing. Their return. Talmage's eyes moved, briefly and without any of the careful avoidance Amos had grown used to in the last quarter hour, to Wren, and settled there, open, curious, entirely without judgment. And I understand we have you to thank for it, miss. Wren, she said. Reverend Talmage, a pleasure. He extended a hand, and Wren, after a beat that Amos understood was her own private measure of the man, took it. I confess I've been hearing a great deal of talk this week that seems to me considerably more concerned with a woman's presence than with the plain fact of her kindness. I find that a strange arithmetic myself, but then I've always found the valley's arithmetic strange on the whole. Some of us have started calling it that exact word, Amos said. Then we're in agreement. It needs better sums run on it. Talmage smiled small and settled his hat back on. Come by the church sometime, either of you. My door doesn't close on account of gossip. Never has. I find gossip generally sorts itself out, given enough time and enough proof of a person's actual character, and I suspect, Mr. Hartwell, that proof is coming, whether the valley's ready for it yet or not. He nodded once to them both and continued on his way, and Amos stood watching him go with something loosening slightly in his chest for the first time since they'd ridden into town. Not everyone, then, Wren said quietly, beside him. No, Amos said, not everyone. They rode home in a silence that wasn't quite the comfortable kind, both of them turning over, separately, everything the town had shown them, and it was near dusk when they came up the last rise before the ranch and found the barn door standing open, banging soft and steady against its frame in a wind that had picked up again with the falling light. I fixed that hinge, Amos said, frowning. Twice already, you fixed it wrong twice already, sounds like. He laughed, short and surprised, the sound catching him off guard, the way it kept doing around her, and went to see about it while she saw to the horses. He found the trouble quick enough once he looked properly, a screw gone loose in wood, soft, with age. The kind of small failure a man stops seeing after he's walked past it enough times without it costing him anything yet. He drove a new screw in deeper, into wood that hadn't already been chewed soft by the old one's turning, and stood back, and the door held. There, he said, mostly to himself, mostly satisfied. That'll hold through spring. Told you, Wren said, from the corral, not looking up from the bay colt's feet, which she was checking the way she checked everything, thorough and unhurried. Man doesn't fix a thing right the first 2 times. It's usually because he's fixing the part that's easy to see instead of the part that's actually broken. That a lesson about hinges or something else. She looked up at that, and something in her face, brief and unguarded, told him she'd meant it exactly as broadly as he'd taken it. Could be both, she said. Generally is. It was full dark by the time he came back into the kitchen, hands cold, temper only slightly improved, to find the hinge already gone from his mind entirely, because of what he found waiting there instead. Wren had the ledger back open, had a second sheet of paper beside it, filled with her own neat, careful figures, and didn't look up right away when he came in, absorbed the way she got absorbed in a thing worth doing properly. I did some sums while you fought the barn door, she said. If we shift the breeding fees up to match what Denby charges and contract the feed south, like I said, this place clears real profit by spring. Not survival money, profit. He stood in the doorway a moment, cold from the wind, tired from the town, and looked at her bent over his ledger in his kitchen, under lamplight that made her look, for one unguarded second, like she'd always belonged exactly there, and felt something move through him that he wasn't ready yet to put a name to, though he suspected, watching her, that a name was coming for it, whether he was ready or not. You didn't have to do that tonight, he said, after the day we had. After the day we had, she said, seemed like exactly the night to do it. Man tries to take something from you with one hand. Best thing you can do is make sure the other hand's building something he can't touch. She finally looked up at him. That's not charity, if that's what's sitting behind your face right now. I'm not doing this out of pity for a man having a hard week. I'm doing it because it's good work, and I'm good at it. And good work deserves doing regardless of who's watching or what they're saying about it in town. I wasn't going to call it charity. Good, she said, because I'd have argued with you about it, and I'm tired, and I'd rather not argue tonight. He almost smiled at that. Almost. And something in the almost smile seemed to satisfy her more than a full one would have, because she went back to her figures, and he sat down across from her, and for a while the only sound in the kitchen was the scratch of her pencil, and the wind finding its way, once more, around the eaves of a house that had started, sometime in the last 4 days, to feel less like a place he survived inside, and more like a place he was building something inside of again. It was 2 evenings after that, with the ledger work finished for the night, and neither of them quite ready yet to say good night, that Wren noticed the small shelf above his desk, 3 books leaning together the way books do when a house doesn't hold many of them and treats the few it has with a certain careful respect. You read, she said, not quite a question. When there's anything worth reading, which isn't often out here. He nodded toward the shelf. There's a farm almanac, mostly useless past its own year, a history of the territory some surveyor wrote and nobody bought, so the printer in town sold it cheap, and a novel that was Ruth's, that I've read twice now because there's been nothing else. Wren crossed to the shelf and took down the territory history, turning it over in her hands the way she turned over most things, weighing it before she committed to it. May I? Take it. Nobody's touched it in years but me, and only twice at that. She read through most of it over the following 2 evenings, settled in the chair nearest the fire while Amos worked through the last of the mending that had been piling up since before the storm. And on the 3rd evening she set it down, closed, and looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize as the one she wore when she'd found something worth saying and was deciding how plainly to say it. It's an honest book, mostly, she said. More honest than most written by men who never had to live the parts they're describing. But there's a chapter on the land grant surveys that reads like the surveyors wrote their own defense before anybody thought to ask them a hard question about it. Talks about empty country, unclaimed ground, like the ground had been sitting there, waiting its whole existence for somebody with a compass and a claim form to finally give it a purpose. Wasn't empty. No, she said, it wasn't. My people held grazing rights on ground 2 counties from its book calls, and I'm reading you the exact words now. Vacant land awaiting settlement. Vacant. She said the word like it had a bad taste to it, which Amos supposed for her it likely did. There's nothing vacant about land somebody's grandmother is buried under. He didn't have an answer for that. Needle lap, needle still, and let the silence hold what it needed to hold. I'm not telling you this to make you feel poorly about a book you didn't write, she said, after a moment, something gentler creeping into her voice. I'm telling you because you asked me, that first night, about breeding, about bloodlines, about the particular arithmetic of what a man builds carefully over years. I've been doing my own arithmetic since I was a girl, watching what gets called vacant and what gets called owned, and who gets to decide the difference. Same wanting that put stakes on your ridge, Amos Hartwell. Just wearing an older coat than Cobb's. I hear you, he said, and meant it plainly, without decoration, the way she seemed to prefer things said. I didn't before, I do now. She studied him a moment, and something in her face eased, the way it had begun, lately, to ease more often around him than it didn't. That's more than most men manage, she said, in considerably longer than 4 evenings. The discovery that changed everything came 6 days later, on a morning that had started, like most of that week's mornings, with nothing more dramatic on the agenda than fence and ledgers. They'd ridden out to check the wire along the north boundary, the stretch running closest to the canyon where Wren had first found the horses, because Amos had a nagging feeling he couldn't quite name, the kind of feeling a man gets when a wound he thought had finished healing starts, without warning, to ache again. The morning was cold and very still, the kind of stillness that makes a man's own breathing sound loud in his ears, and the light coming up over the ridge had that flat, colorless quality it took on in the last hard weeks before spring finally decided to commit to arriving. Amos found himself riding out, thinking less about what they might find and more about how strange it was that 6 days ago, this same stretch of fence had represented nothing worse to him than a chore, and now it felt like riding toward a wound to check whether it had healed clean or festered. It had festered. It was Wren who found it. She always found it first. He was coming to understand some particular attentiveness in her that read ground the way other people read faces. Catching the small tells the rest of the world walked straight past without a second look. She reined in hard, 30 yards short of the gate where they'd found the cut wire 6 days before, and sat very still, looking down at the ground in a way that made Amos's stomach drop before he'd even seen what she was looking at. Amos, just his name, flat, and something in the flatness of it, the particular careful control of it, told him this was worse than the wire, worse than the stakes. He rode up beside her and looked down. Hoofprints, dozens of them, frozen now into the mud beneath the thin crust of old snow, but readable still, weeks-old sign preserved by the cold the way nothing preserved in warmer country ever managed to be. He would have ridden straight past them himself, he understood, looking at the churned ground, and seeing at first only a confusion of marks that told him nothing at all. It was Wren's eye that turned confusion into a story. "These aren't my horse's prints," he said slowly. "Mine were barefoot, unshod, running loose. These are shod." Woman, Wren dismounted, crouched low over the clearest set, tracing the outline without touching it, the way she'd once traced the cut ends of the wire, the way a person studies a wound to understand the weapon that made it. Shod and ridden with purpose. Look at the spacing. Look at how they run. She pointed, her finger following a line that curved wide around the natural drift of the land, a line that made no sense at all, as the path of animals fleeing a storm in perfect sense, as the path of animals being driven, deliberately, by riders positioned to funnel them exactly where the riders wanted them to go. Amos dismounted too, crouched beside her, and made himself look at it properly, the way she was looking at it, instead of the way his first instinct wanted to look at it, which was to look away. "Toward the canyon," he said, the words coming out of him slow, like each one cost him something to say. They didn't just cut the wire and let the storm do the rest. They drove them. Chased my horses into that box canyon on purpose, in the middle of a blizzard, and left them there to freeze or starve, whichever came first. 3 riders at least, maybe 4. Wren stood, her face gone very still, very careful. The particular carefulness he was learning meant she was holding something back that wanted badly to come out as anger. This wasn't an accident dressed up to look deliberate. Amos Hartwell. This was deliberate from the very first moment. Somebody wanted your horses gone bad enough to risk killing them in weather that could just as easy have killed the men doing the driving. Amos sat back on his heels a long moment, looking down at prints that told a story infinitely worse than the one he'd been carrying in his chest for well over a week now. Because a cut wire, he'd told himself, could almost be explained by something less than malice. Petty vandalism. A grudge half-formed, half-acted on. This wasn't that. This was a man, or several men, willing to drive 12 living animals into a killing storm on the calculated gamble that nature would finish what greed had started, and do it in a way that left no fingerprints for anyone to find except the ones frozen now into ground that hadn't thawed since, and might not thaw again before the season fully turned. He thought of the sorrel mare, her leg wedged in that rock crack, fighting it long enough that the fight itself had nearly cost her the leg. He thought of how close, how very close, all 12 of them had come to simply not existing anymore, to being nothing but a story a man told himself on a porch step with a cold cup of coffee going colder in his hand. Anger came up through him then, sudden and total, the kind he hadn't let himself feel in years, because feeling it had never once, in his experience, made a single hard thing easier to carry. "Cobb," he said, just the name flat, the way she said things when the weight of a thing had outgrown decoration. "Can't prove it's Cobb from hoof prints alone, I know that, but I'd wager the same." She crouched again, studying the deepest of the prints, the one nearest the gate. "Whoever rode this horse rides heavy on the outside edge. Favors his left. That's a particular thing, a habit built over years. Not something a man fakes or hides easy. Once you know to look for it. You'd know that print again if you saw it." "I'd know it anywhere," Wren said, and something in her voice, quiet and certain, told him she meant it exactly as plainly as she'd said it. They didn't go to Cobb with it. Not yet. Amos wanted to, badly wanted to ride straight to the man's spread and lay the accusation on his own doorstep and watch his face for the flinch that would confirm what both of them already believed down to their bones. Wren talked him out of it. "A guess, even a strong one, isn't proof," she said, echoing his own words back at him from 6 days before, and he had the grace to recognize the argument for what it was and let it land. You ride over there now, accusing a man like Cobb on nothing but hoofprints and hunches. He'll have 3 witnesses inside the hour, swearing he never left his own porch that week. Men like that always have witnesses ready. It's part of what makes them dangerous. So we wait. So we build what we've got until it's strong enough that no witness he buys can talk it away. She looked at him, steady. I'll ride the boundary again tomorrow, wider this time. See if there's more sign further out, closer to wherever those riders came from before they started driving your herd. He nodded, and they rode home in the fading light. And that night, over supper, neither of them said much, both of them carrying the weight of a truth that had gotten heavier the moment it stopped being an accident and became instead an intention. Whoop. She rode the boundary wider the next morning, alone, before he'd fully finished his coffee, and came back a little past noon with mud dried stiff on her knees and something new sitting behind her eyes. The tracks don't stop at the canyon, she said, swinging down from the mule. They circle wide north, then cut back toward the pass road. Whoever drove your herd didn't come from nowhere. They came from somewhere with a clear trail leading straight to it, and they weren't much troubled about hiding their leaving. Only their arriving. Where's the trail lead? Toward Cobb's spread. Not all the way. I didn't ride onto his land outright. Wasn't fool enough to be caught doing that with no good reason ready if I was seen. But close enough that there's no honest explanation I can think of for 4 shod horses traveling that exact line that exact week. Unless they started or ended their business somewhere on or near his property. Amos felt something settle into place in his chest, grim and certain. That's not proof enough to hang an accusation on, not by itself. No, Wren agreed, but it's another stone on the scale, and stones add up, given enough patience to keep stacking them. She looked at him, steady. I found something else too. One of the prints, clearest of the lot, coming off a stretch of harder ground near the pass. There's a nick in the near fore shoe. Small, a blacksmith's error or a shoe gone slightly wrong in the setting. That's not a thing a rider changes easy mid-winter without good reason to bother. If that horse is still wearing that same shoe, we'll know it the moment we see the print again. You'd know it on sight. I'd know it anywhere, she said again. The same words she'd used at the canyon, and this time Amos heard, underneath the flat certainty of them, something closer to a promise than a simple statement of fact. Reverend Talmadge rode out not many mornings after, unannounced, which Amos understood by now to be simply the man's way, no message sent ahead. No ceremony, just a thin figure on a steady horse coming up the trail at an hour that suggested he'd started the ride before he'd fully decided what he meant to say once he arrived. Wasn't expecting company, Amos said, meeting him at the fence. Wasn't expecting to come, if I'm honest. But I heard Cobb had already been round once with a proposal you turned down flat. And I heard the town's been talking in that particular way. It talks when it's decided a story, before it's bothered collecting the facts to support it. And I found I couldn't sit comfortable at my own desk, knowing that without at least riding out to hear your side of it plain. Talmadge dismounted, slow, his old knees clearly no friendlier to him than Amos's own. I won't pretend I know the whole shape of your trouble, but I've buried enough good men run off their land by patient, well-dressed greed to recognize the early smell of it when it rides through my own church door, asking careful questions about a neighbor's business. Wren came out from the barn at the sound of voices, and Talmadge greeted her with the same open, unguarded courtesy he'd shown her in town, hat off, hand extended. Miss Wren, I hope the valley's welcome hasn't been too unkind. It's been what it's been, Reverend. I've known worse welcomes in better-dressed towns. That's a low bar. I'm sorry to hear this place is cleared. He almost smiled at his own words, then sobered. I'll say plain what I came to say, and then I'll get out from underfoot, because I expect you've both got work that doesn't stop on my account. If this trouble with Cobb comes to a reckoning in town, before a judge, wherever it lands, I'll stand up and say what I've seen with my own eyes. A man doing right by a stranger who did right by him first. That's not much, against a man with Cobb's money behind him, but it's not nothing either, and I'd rather you have it than not. Amos felt something ease in his chest, small but real, the particular relief of discovering a debt of goodwill in a ledger he'd assumed, these last 2 weeks, was running entirely in the red. That's more than I expected, Reverend. More than most in this valley have offered. Most in this valley, Talmadge said, settling his hat back on, haven't yet had the courage to ask themselves why they're so comfortable, believing the worst of a woman who's done nothing but honest work since she arrived, and so comfortable extending patience to a man who spent 8 years quietly buying up everything he can get his hands on. I find, in my experience, that's rarely an accident of instinct. It's usually a choice, dressed up to look like one. He nodded to them both. Send word if you need me. I mean that plainly, not as a courtesy. He rode out the way he'd come, unhurried, and Amos stood watching him go with Wren beside him, the cold afternoon air sharp in his lungs. Not everyone, Wren said again, echoing the words from the street outside the saloon. No, Amos said, not everyone. And it's starting to feel like that might matter more than I gave it credit for. Cobb finally broke the quiet not many days after, though this time he sent word ahead of himself. He sent a rider ahead with word that he'd be by that afternoon on other business, and would appreciate a few minutes of Amos's time, phrasing it polite, phrasing it like a man extending a courtesy rather than announcing an intention, and Amos understood, reading the note, that the politeness itself was the warning. Cobb arrived a little past 3. Alone this time, no folded paper in his coat, which told Amos before a single word passed between them that this visit wasn't about loans anymore. Hartwell. Cobb didn't dismount right away, sat his horse at the yard fence, looking out at the pasture the way he'd the first time, the way a man looks at something he still hasn't fully given up believing might someday belong to him. Got your answer. Short one. Didn't see the need for more words than that. No, suppose you didn't. Cobb's eyes moved, unhurried, toward the barn where Wren was visible through the open door, working a currycomb through the sorrel mare's coat, her back to the yard, though Amos didn't for one moment believe she wasn't hearing every word carried on the still afternoon air. I'll be honest with you, Hartwell, since honesty seems to be the fashion between us lately. I'd hoped you'd see reason. A ranch your size, carrying the kind of debt you're likely carrying after losing a whole string to weatherman in your position, generally takes the rope that's offered, regardless of what hook might be sitting at the end of it. I read the terms close, Cobb. Knew exactly what hook I was looking at. Did you? Something shifted in Cobb's face then, the pleasant mask slipping just enough for Amos to see, for one unguarded second, the calculation underneath it. Then perhaps you'll appreciate a more direct conversation than the last one. I'm listening. There's a lieutenant stationed 2 days' ride from here, name of Corwin. Young man. Earnest. The kind who takes his procedures seriously, which is either a blessing or a curse depending on which side of the procedure you happen to be standing. Cobb said it easy, unhurried, the way he said everything, but Amos felt the words land like stones dropped one at a time into still water, each one sending its own cold ring outward. It's come to my attention that you've been harboring an unregistered party on this property. A woman, traveling alone, no documentation, no sponsor, no clear account of her business in the territory. That's the kind of thing that concerns the military. Hartwell, given the current state of things out here, concerns them a great deal. Amos felt something in his chest go very cold and very still. The particular stillness that comes just before a man understands he's about to be forced to choose between two things he doesn't want to choose between. You're threatening to report her. I'm not threatening anything. Cobb's voice stayed mild, pleasant, entirely reasonable, and that was the worst part of it. The reasonableness, the way a man could stand there and hand another man a blade without once raising his voice or admitting his own hand was on the hilt. I'm simply observing that certain facts, once they come to a lieutenant's attention, tend to require investigation, regardless of anyone's personal feelings about the matter. I'd hate for that investigation to prove difficult for her, or costly for you, given how a valley talks once soldiers start asking questions on a man's own front porch. And if I sign the loan, then perhaps certain facts never quite make their way to that lieutenant's attention at all. Facts have a way of staying quiet, when the man holding them has no particular reason to speak them out loud. There it was, plain as Amos had ever heard it, dressed still in Cobb's careful, reasonable coat, but plain enough now that no amount of coat could hide the shape of what stood underneath it. Amos looked at the man a long moment, and felt, beneath the cold fear settling into his chest, something else rising up alongside it. Something harder, something that had been 11 years in the building and wasn't about to be talked out of existence by a man who cut wire in the dark and hid behind other men's uniforms to do the rest of his dirty work in daylight. Get off my land, Cobb. Something flickered behind Cobb's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the first thin edge of something closer to genuine anger. I'd think carefully before answering me that way, Hartwell. I have thought carefully. Thought about it plenty these last 2 weeks. Watching you offer me a rope with one hand while your riders drove my herd into a blizzard with the other. He hadn't meant to say it, not yet. Not before they had proof enough to make the accusation stick. But the words came anyway, driven out of him by something past patience now. You want to report her, report her. You want to call in whatever debts you think you're owed, call them in. But you'll do it knowing I've got hoof prints on my north boundary that tell a very particular story about shod horses driven with purpose and a man who rides heavy on his left. And I expect, given enough time, we'll find out exactly whose horse that is. For a long moment, Cobb said nothing at all. The pleasant mask was entirely gone now, and what underneath it was colder than anything Amos had yet seen on the man's face. Colder and far more dangerous, because it was, for the first time, entirely honest. That's an accusation with no proof behind it, Cobb said, finally quiet. Not yet, Amos said, but soon. Cobb sat his horse a moment longer, and then, without another word, turned and rode back the way he'd come, and this time there was no unhurried performance left in it at all, just a man riding fast toward whatever move he intended to make next. Wren came out of the barn as the sound of hooves faded down the trail, the currycomb still in her hand, her face carrying none of its usual careful stillness. What was there instead, plain and unguarded for the first time since Amos had known her, was something closer to fear. He'll go to that lieutenant now, she said. Today, likely. Before you've got proof enough to stop him. I know it. I've run before, Amos Hartwell. I know how that story goes, and I know it doesn't generally end with the soldier deciding in favor of the person without the paper proving she belongs somewhere. She set the currycomb down on the fence rail, careful, deliberate, the way a person sets something down when their hands need somewhere steady to be. I could leave. Tonight, before he sends anyone, save you the trouble I've brought onto this place. No, Amos said, and it came out of him fast, harder than he'd meant it, but he didn't take a single word of it back. You didn't bring this trouble. Cobb brought it, same as he brought the storm down on my horses. You leaving doesn't undo one thing he's done, and it doesn't make this place 1 degree safer for either of us. It just means he wins twice instead of once. Wren looked at him a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that he couldn't fully name. Gratitude tangled up with wariness, tangled up with something else entirely that neither of them was yet ready to put a plain word to. All right, she said, finally quiet. Then we'd best be ready when he comes. They didn't talk much through supper that evening, both of them carrying the weight of what Cobb had said, and it was only after the dishes were cleared and the fire banked low that Wren spoke again, from her chair near the hearth, her voice quieter than Amos had yet heard it. I've thought about running before, she said. More than once these last months, whenever a place started feeling too settled, too much like somewhere I could be found, and asked questions I didn't have good answers for. Easier, some nights, to keep moving than to stand still long enough to be seen. Amos sat across from her, the ledger closed on the table between them for once, no numbers needing tending tonight. Tonight, I mean, when I told you I didn't want you to. She was quiet a moment, watching the low fire the way she seemed to watch most things, unhurried, considering. Because you asked me to stay knowing full well what it might cost you. Man doesn't do that without meaning it. And I've spent enough of my life around people who said kind things without meaning them that I've gotten fairly good at telling the difference. She looked up at him. You meant it. I did. Then I'd be a fool to run from the one door that's opened honest, just because I'm more practiced at running than I am at staying. She said it plain, the way she said most things. But there was something underneath the plainness tonight, something rawer than he'd heard from her before. Doesn't mean I'm not afraid. I am. I've been afraid a long while now, long enough that I've mostly stopped noticing it as anything separate from just being alive. But afraid and wrong aren't always the same thing. And I've decided, tonight, that staying isn't wrong, whatever it costs either of us. Amos looked at her across the low firelight and felt something in his chest that he still didn't have an easy name for, though he was starting to suspect the name existed, sitting just past the edge of what he was willing to admit to himself on a night already heavy with enough admissions. Ruth used to say a thing, he said instead, quieter than he'd meant to say it, that the ranch was never really the land or the horses, or any of what a deed says a man owns. Said it was whoever chose to stand on it with you, day after day, when standing there had gotten hard. Said the land was just the place that happened to be under everybody's feet while the choosing got done. Wren was quiet a long moment, the firelight moving soft across her face. She sounds like she understood something most people spend a whole lifetime missing. She did. He looked at the fire, then back at her. I think I'm only now starting to understand it myself. 15 years late. Better late, Wren said, than never arriving at all. Neither of them said anything else for a while, and the quiet between them, Amos found, had stopped being the kind that needed filling entirely and become instead a kind of shelter Both of them seemed to have decided, without discussing it, that they'd rather sit inside together than face what was coming alone. It was 2 mornings later, gray and still, with the smell of more snow hanging low in the air, that they heard a second rider coming up the North Trail, and this one Amos knew before he'd even fully turned to look, because he'd seen that particular uniform enough times passing through the territory to recognize its cut and color from 100 yards off. Wren went very still beside him. "Lieutenant," she said, low, and something in the single word carried more history than Amos had time, in that moment, to ask her to explain. The rider drew up at the yard fence, a young man, younger than Amos had expected, given the weight the uniform seemed to carry, with the particular careful bearing of someone new enough to authority that he still felt obligated to prove he deserved it. "Mr. Hartwell? That's me, Lieutenant Corwin. I've had a report brought to my attention." His eyes moved, deliberate, unhurried in a way that reminded Amos, with a cold, unpleasant jolt, of Cobb's own unhurried attention 2 mornings before, concerning an unregistered party traveling this territory without documentation. "A woman matching a description I've been given, said to be residing currently at this address." He looked, then, directly at Wren, and the whole yard seemed to Amos to go very quiet, the way it had gone quiet the morning the horses came home, except this silence carried nothing like relief inside it. "I'll need to ask the two of you some questions," Corwin said, "and I'd ask you both to consider carefully how you answer them, because a false statement to an officer of the United States military is a separate matter entirely from whatever the truth of this situation turns out to be." Amos felt Wren's eyes on him, steady, unreadable, waiting to see what he'd say, what he'd choose, in the first cold seconds of a morning that had just turned, without warning, into the most dangerous one either of them had faced yet. He looked at the lieutenant. He looked at the paper the man was already unfolding from his coat, the careful official lines of it, the particular ordinary cruelty of a threat that arrived not with a raised voice, but with proper documentation and a young man's earnest belief in his own procedure. And he understood, with a clarity that settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, exactly whose hand had guided that report into the lieutenant's saddlebag in the first place. "Ask your questions, Lieutenant," Amos said, "but you'll get the truth from me, and the truth is this. That woman rode 12 horses down off a mountain and gave a man back the whole of his life's work, and I'll stand behind every part of that truth in front of you, or a judge, or the whole of this valley, whichever you'd prefer to arrange." Corwin's eyes flickered, the first crack in his careful official bearing. "That's not quite the answer I was sent out here expecting, Mr. Hartwell." "No," Amos said. "I don't imagine it is. I'll speak for myself, Lieutenant." Wren's voice cut across the yard, quiet but entirely steady, and both men turned to find her already stepping down from the barn doorway, closing the distance between them at an unhurried pace that Amos recognized by now as exactly the pace she used when she decided a thing was worth doing properly and wasn't about to be rushed through it by anybody's nerves but her own. "You've got questions. I've got answers. No need for Mr. Hartwell to stand between us like I can't manage my own account of myself." Corwin studied her a moment, and something in his careful official bearing seemed, briefly, uncertain how to proceed against a person who wasn't behaving the way his procedure had likely prepared him for her to behave. "Name," he said finally. "Wren, full name." "That's the name I give," she said, and there was nothing defiant in the way she said it, only a plain, unshakable fact, down flat the way she laid most things down. "It served me fine across 4 territories and 29 days of trail to get here. I don't see the necessity of it serving you any different. I've been told you're traveling without documentation, without a sponsor." That your Corwin hesitated, and Amos watched the young man search for a word that wouldn't sound. Out loud, as ugly as it plainly was in his notes. "Unaffiliated with any recognized party or agency currently operating in this territory." "It's true," Wren said. "I'm unaffiliated because the party I was traveling with scattered at the Bitterroot crossing, same as parties do in bad weather, and I've been making my own way since, same as any traveler might. I've broken no law I'm aware of, Lieutenant. I found a man's lost horses and returned them to him. If there's a regulation against that, I'd be glad to hear it read to me plain so I understand exactly what it is I've done wrong. It's not so simple a matter as that, and I expect you know it." "I know it's not simple for you," she said. "I expect it's considerably simpler for me. I've been moving through country that isn't required to explain itself to anybody either, and I've managed, so far, not to ask it to." Something in her tone, calm and unhurried and utterly without fear, seemed to unsettle Corwin more than open defiance would have. He looked down at his paper again, and Amos watched him, read whatever was written there a second time, as if hoping it might say something different on review than it had the first time through. "There's a concern," Corwin said, more careful now, "that a woman traveling alone in this territory, this time of year, given the current tensions, might be connected to parties the Army has an active interest in locating. I'm not accusing you of anything, understand? I'm required to ask, then ask it plain, and I'll answer it plain. Are you connected to any hostile party currently operating in this territory?" "No," Wren said, and the single word carried a weight Amos felt land somewhere in his own chest, because he understood, hearing it, that she'd likely been asked some version of that question more than once in 29 days of traveling, and had likely answered it, each time with the same flat, exhausted patience she was offering it with now. "I'm a woman who lost her home to men making decisions about land that was never theirs to decide about, and I've spent the month since trying to find a place to stand that nobody else has decided yet to take from me. That's the whole of my connection to anything you're worried about, Lieutenant. I'd think a soldier who's spent any real time in this territory would have met 100 women telling him the same story, if he was willing to actually listen to it, instead of just filing it away as a concern." Corwin didn't answer that right away. Something moved across his face, young and uncertain, the particular expression of a man discovering that the clean lines of his procedure didn't map as neatly onto an actual person standing in front of him as they had onto the paper in his saddlebag. "Mr. Hartwell," he said instead, turning back to Amos, "can you vouch for how long this woman has been residing at your property?" "Since the morning she brought my herd home. Little over 2 weeks now, and your relationship to her is—" "She's a guest of this ranch," Amos said, "same as anybody would be who did what she did for me. I've offered her a room and my thanks. And, lately, my trust, which she's earned every single day she's stayed under this roof. If you're asking whether there's some impropriety you ought to be concerned about, Lieutenant, I'd ask you to look a little harder at the man who sent you out with that concern in the first place, and a little less hard at the woman standing in my yard who's done nothing this whole territory but help a stranger and read the ground honest. You believe this report was made in bad faith? I believe it was made by a man who wants my water and couldn't get it through the front door, so he's trying the side window now, same as she warned me he would." Amos held the lieutenant's gaze steady. "I've got hoof prints on my north boundary, Lieutenant, from riders who drove my whole herd into a blizzard on purpose, weeks back, hoping the storm would finish what they started. I've got survey stakes on the ridge above my water that don't belong to me and weren't put there with my knowledge or my leave. And I've got a neighbor who offered me a loan with a hook, buried 3 paragraphs deep in it, and when I turned him down flat, he told me plain to my face that certain facts might stop needing to reach your ears if I reconsidered. I expect, if you're half the careful investigator your procedure wants you to be, you might find that story worth looking into a good deal more than you'll find hers." Corwin was quiet a long moment, and Amos watched something shift behind the young man's eyes, not disbelief, not yet full belief either, but the particular unsettled look of a man who has arrived somewhere, expecting one simple story and found instead a second story tangled up inside the first one, considerably harder to walk away from without examining closer. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Hartwell. It's a true one. I'll swear to it in front of anyone you like." The lieutenant looked between them, at Amos standing solid in his own yard, at Wren beside him with her chin level and her eyes unflinching, and Amos understood, watching the calculation move across the young man's face, that whatever Corwin had ridden up that trail expecting to find, it hadn't been this a rancher, standing his ground in plain daylight, and a woman answering for herself in a voice that never once wavered, and a story about stolen water and cut wire that complicated, considerably, whatever simple procedure had been handed to him along with his orders. "I'll need to file a report either way," Corwin said finally. "That's not something I have discretion to set aside, whatever I personally make of the matter. I'll note your account of Mr. Cobb's conduct, and I'll note the two of you have both cooperated fully. But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Hartwell, my superiors don't always share my patience for complicated stories, especially when unaffiliated parties concerned. I'd advise you both to have whatever proof you're gathering ready sooner rather than later. I can only hold a simple version of events at bay so long, and I suspect Mr. Cobb won't wait politely while you gather it." "How long?" Amos said. "I couldn't say exactly. A matter of weeks, likely, before this gets escalated past my own discretion, if it escalates at all. Corwin folded his paper back into his coat, and something in his face, young and uncertain still, but no longer quite as certain of the ground he'd ridden in on, softened just slightly. For what it's worth, Mr. Hartwell, and I'll deny saying this, if it's ever repeated back to me, I've met a fair number of men in this territory this year making accusations against women traveling alone. This is the first time I've believed the man doing the accusing was likely lying, and the woman likely telling me the truth. He touched his hat to Amos, and then, with a small, careful nod that seemed to cost him something against his own training, to Wren as well, and turned his horse back down the trail the way he'd come. Neither of them moved until the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely into the gray hush of the coming snow. "Weeks," Amos said finally, quiet. "That's all the time we've got, before Cobb finds a way to push this past a young lieutenant's patience." "Weeks is more than we had an hour ago," Wren said. She was still looking down the empty trail, her face unreadable again, the careful stillness back in place now that the danger had passed, though Amos suspected it had cost her something to hold that stillness through the whole of the last quarter hour, and would cost her something more later, once she let herself feel the whole of what had just happened. "We'd best make it count." The first real flakes of the coming storm began to drift down across the yard, slow and unhurried, settling on the fence rails, on the barn fruit, on the 12 horses grazing easy in the near pasture, unbothered by any of it, the way animals generally were unbothered by the particular shape of the danger circling the humans responsible for them. Amos looked at Wren standing beside him in the falling snow, and felt, underneath the fear, underneath the cold new urgency of a deadline neither of them had asked for, something steady and certain settling into place in his chest, the same something that had been building in him, quiet and unacknowledged, since the morning 12 horses came down a mountain trail, behind a woman who owed him nothing and had given him back his whole life anyway. "Whatever comes," he said, "we'll meet it standing exactly where we're standing now." Wren looked at him, and for the first time since the lieutenant's horse had crested the rise that morning, something in her face eased, just slightly, into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "Beside each other," she said. "Beside each other," he agreed. Behind them, the snow kept falling, soft and steady, over a ranch that had, in the space of 2 short weeks, become something worth fighting for all over again. And somewhere down the valley, Amos knew without needing to see it, Silas Cobb was already calculating his next move, and the clock the lieutenant had left behind him had already quietly begun to run. Arizona Territory, 1,865, a matter of weeks, Corwin had said, and a man could spend a matter of weeks 2 ways. He could spend them waiting, watching the trail for the next rider bringing the next piece of bad news, or he could spend them building something solid enough that when the next rider came, he'd have more than fear waiting within the gate. He lay awake that first night, turning the choice over the way he'd turned over so much these last weeks, and found himself thinking, of all things, of the morning he'd set his boots by the door and decided the horses were gone for good. He'd been wrong that morning, wrong about the horses, wrong, too, about what a man his age could still manage to fight for, given enough reason and enough help standing beside him, because waiting had never once, in 43 years, solved a single hard thing for him. Waiting was what a man did when he'd already decided, somewhere quiet and unspoken, that the outcome wasn't his to shape, and he was done deciding that, had been done with it, he suspected, since the exact moment a woman on a gray mule had asked him 2 plain words across his own yard and refused to let him keep believing. His life was already finished. Amos chose the second way. He didn't examine the choosing too hard. He simply woke the next morning and told Wren over coffee, neither of them let go cold this time, that waiting was finished. "We stop reacting to him," he said. "We go find what he doesn't want found." Wren looked at him over the rim of her cup, and something in her face, approval, maybe, or simple recognition of a decision she'd been waiting for him to arrive at on his own, the matter without either of them needing to say more about it. "Then we'd best start with the men he's already used up," she said. "A man like Cobb doesn't keep the same hands forever. Somebody's always leaving his employ unhappy. Those are the ones who'll talk, if you ask them right, and ask them where nobody's listening who'd carry the asking back to him." The name came from Cutler, of all people, not offered kindly, about the feed merchant's manner had softened since the last visit, but offered anyway, the way a careful man sometimes lets a fact slip loose when he's decided, privately, and which side of a quarrel he'd rather not be caught standing entirely against. "There's a man," Cutler said, weighing out grain he hadn't been asked to weigh yet, not quite looking at Amos while he said it. "Rode for Cobb most of last year. Left this winter sudden, no notice given. Living rough now, out past the old Holt place, doing day work where he can find it." A pause, the scale still swinging slightly though nothing new had been added to it. "Man named Dell. Wouldn't say I sent you." "Wouldn't say anything, Cutler. Wasn't planning to." Cutler's eyes came up then, brief, and something passed across them that wasn't quite an apology, but was closer to one than anything the man had offered since the trouble started. "Good luck to you, Hartwell. That's all I'll say plain." They found Dell 2 days later, splitting wood for a widow near the old Holt place in exchange for a meal and or to sleep in. A thin, weathered man not yet 40 who flinched hard at the sight of a stranger's horse coming up the lane before he recognized Amos wasn't anyone he needed to fear. The lane was rutted and half frozen, the widow's small house sagging at one corner, the way houses sag when there's no longer a man's steady hand keeping up with the small repairs a place always needs. And Amos felt, riding up it, an unexpected kinship with whoever lived there, another life balanced on a thin margin, another person one bad season away from losing everything they'd built. He wondered, not for the first time, how many quiet ruins Cobb's slow accumulation of land and leverage had left scattered across this valley, unremarked, unrecorded anywhere but in the sagging corners of houses like this one. "Hartwell," Dell said, setting down the axe. "Heard your name mentioned around. Didn't expect you'd have cause to come looking for me." "I've got cause. You rode for Cobb." Something closed in Dell's face fast, the particular shutting down of a man who has decided, already, that whatever comes next in this conversation isn't going to be comfortable for him. Rode for a lot of men. Not asking about a lot of men. Asking about Cobb and about 4 riders and a herd of horses driven into a blizzard back before Christmas. Amos kept his voice level, kept it plain, the way Wren handled most hard things, laying the truth down flat instead of dressing it up to be easier to swallow. "I'm not here to see you hang for it, Dell. I'm here because I lost near everything that week and got it back only by luck and a stranger's kindness, and I mean to make sure the men who did it answer for it before they try the same thing on somebody who isn't so lucky." Dell was quiet a long while, looking at the axe in his hands like it might offer him an answer he didn't have the courage to find on his own. Behind him, at the house, a curtain moved slightly. The widow, Amos understood, watching the exchange from inside, likely as wary of a stranger's sudden arrival as Dell himself had been. "I left his employ over it," Dell said finally. "Low, that work. Didn't sign on to run horses into weather that could have killed them, or killed me alongside them. Told him so plain the night after, and he told me plain right back that a man too soft for hard work wasn't a man he had further use for. Been scraping since. Widow here's kind enough to feed me for the wood, but it's not steady and winter's not done with us yet." "You'd say that plain? In front of a lieutenant? In front of the whole valley if it came to that?" Dell's jaw worked a moment, fear plain on his face, the particular fear of a poor man weighing what little he had left against a rich man's reach. "He'd ruin me for it. Man like Cobb doesn't forgive being crossed. I've seen what he does to men who cross him. Watched it happen to 2 others before I ever signed on with him myself." "He's already ruining me," Amos said. "Already tried ruining a woman who did nothing but bring my horses home. He doesn't stop on his own, Dell. Somebody has to make him stop." Wren stepped forward then, quiet, and something in her manner steady, unhurried, the same quality that had, weeks ago, talked a frightened mare into trusting a stranger's hand seemed to reach Dell in a way Amos's plain argument hadn't quite managed alone. "I know what it is," she said, to weigh speaking against staying safe. "I've done that weighing more times than I care to count these last months. But I'll tell you what I've learned doing it. Silence doesn't keep a person safe forever. It just delays whose turn it is to pay for somebody else's wrongdoing." She held his gaze. "You already left him once, because your conscience wouldn't let you keep riding for a man who'd do that to living animals. Seems to me the conscience that made you leave is the same one that already knows what you ought to do now." Dell looked between them a long moment, and something in his shoulders, tight since the moment he'd recognized trouble riding up the lane, eased, just slightly, into something that looked almost like relief. "All right," he said. "I'll say it plain. Whoever needs hearing it." They rode home that evening with the first real piece of solid ground under them, a witness willing who could place Cobb's own instruction behind the driving of the herd. It wasn't everything, but it was no longer only hoofprints and hunches, and Amos felt, for the first time since the morning he'd found the cut wire, something that wasn't quite hope, but stood close enough to its shadow to matter. The confirmation came 3 days after that, and it came, fittingly enough, in town. They'd ridden in for supplies again, bracing themselves, as they'd learned too, for whatever coldness the street might offer, and Amos found himself riding in, thinking of how strange it was that a street he'd walked his whole adult life could come to feel, in the space of a few short weeks, like enemy ground he had to steel himself to cross. He didn't like the feeling. He liked less that he was starting to get used to it. What they found instead was Silas Cobb himself dismounting outside the feed store, and Wren went still beside Amos the instant her eyes found the horse he'd ridden in on. "That's the shoe," she said, low, urgent, her whole body gone taut, the way it went taut whenever her eye caught something worth catching. "Near 4. The nick I marked at the canyon, that's the same horse." Amos looked, and saw nothing himself but an ordinary bay gelding, standing patient at the rail, its coat well groomed, its tack expensive and well kept, nothing about it marking it out as anything other than what any prosperous man's second-best horse might look like on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He trusted her eyes anyway. He'd learned by now exactly how much trust her eyes had earned. Across 2 months of watching them read a mare's healing leg, and a stranger's careful lie, and a length of cut wire that had told her, in a glance, a story he himself had needed a full minute crouched in the cold to begin to piece together. "You're certain? I'd know it anywhere," she said, for the third time now, and this time the words landed in Amos's chest with the full weight of everything they'd been building toward these last weeks. Cobb turned, caught sight of them both, and something flickered across his face, not quite alarm. Cobb was too practiced for outright alarm, but the thinnest possible crack in the pleasant mask he wore everywhere he went. "Hartwell," he said, touching his hat, his voice carrying its usual easy warmth. "Still gathering evidence for that accusation of yours?" "Getting closer every day," Amos said. "Fine horse you're riding today, Cobb. Don't recall seeing that particular gelding before." Something behind Cobb's eyes went very still, very careful, and for one unguarded second, Amos watched the man do the same arithmetic he himself had been doing for weeks now, watched him realize, in real time, exactly what a nicked horseshoe might mean to a woman who read ground the way other people read faces. "Ordinary horse," Cobb said. "Nothing worth remarking on." "We'll let the lieutenant decide that," Amos said, "when the time comes." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked into the feed store with Wren beside him, and behind them he heard Cobb mount and ride off faster than the man's usual unhurried pace generally allowed. And Amos understood that they had, without quite meaning to, just told Cobb precisely how close the noose had drawn. "That was reckless," Wren said, once they were clear of town. "Maybe, but a scared man makes mistakes a calm one doesn't. You taught me that yourself, weeks back, standing at my own gate." "I did." Something that might have been the beginning of a real smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Didn't expect you to learn the lesson quite this thoroughly." They spent the following days gathering what remained to gather. Amos rode to the county seat himself, 2 days there and 2 days back, sleeping rough the one night the weather wouldn't allow him to make a way station before dark, and he returned tired and saddle-sore but carrying a copy of the original survey filing which, once compared against the stakes still sitting up on his ridge, showed a discrepancy no honest surveyor could explain away as innocent error, a boundary quietly redrawn. On paper, months before Cobb's men had ever driven a single stake into the frozen ground to match it. Wren spent those same days riding the boundary once more, alone through weather that had turned raw and unforgiving again, and returned each evening with her hands chapped and her face windburned, but her resolve, if anything, sharpened rather than worn down by the effort. She marked every remaining trace of the driven herd's path on a hand-drawn map that would have done credit to any surveyor Amos had ever met. Honest or otherwise, distances paced out and noted, directions confirmed against the sun, the whole trail rendered in lines so careful and precise that Amos found himself studying it by lamplight, newly amazed at the particular quality of attention she brought to absolutely everything she touched. By the time Amos returned, they had laid out together on the kitchen table under lamplight the whole shape of it, the cut wire still bearing its clean, deliberate edge, the stakes and the false survey behind them, side by side where any honest eye could compare the two and see the lie plain, the hoofprints and the nicked shoe, and Dell's willingness to say plain what Cobb had ordered done, the loan with its buried clause, and Cobb's own words, spoken to Amos's face, about facts that might stay quiet if a man reconsidered, which Amos had written down. That same evening, word for word, while the memory of them was still sharp enough to trust. That's enough, Wren said, looking at it all laid out. Not a guess anymore, a case. Questions what we do with it. We take it to the one place Cobb can't buy his way quiet, Wren said, in front of everybody who spent these last weeks believing the story he handed them instead of the truth he was hiding. Let the valley see both stories side by side and decide honest which one holds up. The chance came sooner than either of them expected, and it came in a shape neither of them had planned for. Reverend Talmage sent word that Sunday that Lieutenant Corwin would be attending service as a courtesy call. The note said, part of the young officer's regular circuit through the territory's small congregations, meant to reassure a nervous population that the Army hadn't forgotten them. Cobb, Talmage added, in a second line clearly meant as warning rather than information, had already sent his own note requesting a few minutes after the service to formally lodge his complaint against the unregistered woman, residing at the Hartwell place, timed, it seemed, to land in front of the lieutenant, with the whole valley still gathered and listening. He means to do it public, Amos said, reading the note twice, the way Ruth had taught him to read anything that mattered. Force the lieutenant's hand in front of witnesses, so there's no quiet way out of it for anybody. Then we do it public too, Wren said. Let him. The church at Larkin's Crossing had never held so full a congregation, not in all the years Amos had been attending it, and he understood, walking in with Wren beside him, and a leather satchel of evidence held tight under his arm, that word of the coming confrontation had traveled the valley faster than any Sunday sermon ever had. Every pew was full, and men who normally stood at the back rail, rather than trouble themselves with a full service, had come early enough to claim seats, and Amos felt the weight of all those eyes the moment he crossed the threshold, the particular weight of a valley that had spent 2 months deciding what to think of him, and had now gathered, whether it fully admitted it to itself or not, to find out whether it had decided rightly. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He'd expected, walking up the frozen path from where they'd tied the horses, that his nerve might fail him somewhere between the door and the pew, the way it so often had these last 15 years whenever a room's attention settled on him for longer than a passing greeting required. It didn't fail him. He understood, glancing once at Wren beside him, exactly why. A man finds a different kind of steadiness in himself. He was learning, when the thing he's standing up for is bigger than his own comfort. Cobb was already there, seated near the front, with the particular easy confidence of a man who has never once, in 8 years, been made to answer for anything in front of an audience he couldn't quietly buy or intimidate into silence afterward. He turned as Amos entered, and something crossed his face surprise. Amos thought that the confrontation he'd planned to have quietly after the service had apparently already begun the moment Amos walked through the door with a satchel in hand. Talmage, from the pulpit, caught Amos's eye and gave the smallest possible nod, an invitation understood, without a word needing to pass between them. The service went by in a blur Amos couldn't afterward have described in any detail. What he remembered clearly was the moment it ended, and Cobb rose, smooth and confident, addressing Corwin directly across the heads of a congregation, gone very quiet and very attentive. Lieutenant, if I might have a moment of your time. A matter of some urgency, concerning an unregistered. I'll take that moment too, Lieutenant, Amos said, standing, his voice carrying clear across the hushed room. Since Mr. Cobb's decided to make this a public matter, I'd like the chance to make it a full one. A murmur moved through the congregation, low, curious, and Amos felt every eye in the room settle on him at once. The particular weight of a valley's attention that he'd spent weeks now, bracing himself against and finding, in this moment, he could bear after all. Mr. Hartwell. Corwin's voice was careful, official, but something in his eyes, meeting Amos's, carried a flicker of the same uncertain openness he'd shown weeks before in the yard. This isn't the setting I'd have chosen for a formal matter. It's the setting. Mr. Tsukobbs chose Lieutenant timing his complaint for a morning. He knew the whole valley would be gathered to hear it. Seems only fair the whole valley hears the rest of the story alongside it. Cobb's easy confidence had gone brittle now, his eyes moving fast around the room, doing the arithmetic of an audience. He could no longer control the way he'd controlled every room he'd ever walked into in this valley. This is hardly the place. I've got a satchel here, Lieutenant, and I'll lay out everything in it, plain, for you and for anyone else who cares to see it. Amos stepped forward, into the aisle, and set the satchel down on the small table near the pulpit, opening it with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere in the last several minutes, without his noticing exactly when. Wire cut clean from my own gate the night my herd went missing. Survey stakes, driven onto my land without my knowledge, marking a waterline that doesn't belong to Mr. Cobb, alongside the county filing that shows exactly how that survey was falsified. A map drawn honest, tracking hoofprints from 4 shod horses that drove my herd into a blizzard on purpose. Prints that lead, near as any honest tracker could follow them, straight toward Mr. Cobb's own land. The room had gone entirely silent now, the particular silence of a whole congregation holding its breath together. And I've got a witness, Amos continued. A man who rode for Mr. Cobb until the night he was ordered to drive 12 living animals into a killing storm and left that employ rather than keep doing it. He's outside now, Lieutenant, waiting on your word, ready to say plain what he was told and by whom. Cobb's face had gone the color of old ash. This is a fabrication. Conspiracy between a desperate man and a woman with every reason to want me discredited. I haven't said one word about the woman yet. Cobb, Amos said, quiet. And something in the quiet of it landed harder than shouting could have. Interesting that you'd reach for her first, before you'd reach for any defense of the wire, or the stakes, or the map. Almost like you understand better than anyone in this room exactly how solid the rest of it is. Cobb's eyes swept the room fast, searching for allies among faces that, one by one, seemed to be finding somewhere else to look rather than meet his gaze. Amos watched the exact moment the man understood. He had none left in this room worth counting on, and something almost pitying moved through him at the sight of it, buried underneath the satisfaction he couldn't quite pretend he didn't feel. You have no proof any of this connects to me personally, Cobb said, his voice climbing, the careful pleasant mask cracking further with every word. Hoofprints, a disgruntled former hand with an obvious grudge, a woman with every reason in the world to lie on this man's behalf. This is a valley turning on one of its most established citizens over the word of honest men and women who've got nothing to gain from lying and considerable reason to fear speaking at all. Talmadge said, from the pulpit, his voice carrying clear and hard across the room, in a tone Amos had never once heard the gentle old reverend use before. I'd think carefully, Silas, before you finish that sentence in front of this congregation. Some of us have known you 8 years. Some of us have watched, quiet, as ranch after ranch changed hands into yours, and told ourselves each time it was simply business, simply misfortune, simply the ordinary churn of a hard territory. I confess, standing here now, I no longer believe any of us were looking closely enough. Wren stepped forward then, to stand beside him, and faced the lieutenant with the same level, unflinching composure she'd shown him weeks before in the yard. I'll say my piece too, Lieutenant, same as I did before. I'm the woman Mr. Cobb spent his complaint building around. I found this man's horses, wedged half dead in a rock crevice, and I brought them home, because leaving them to die struck me as wrong, whatever else it might have cost me to do it. I've broken no law. I've told you the truth every single time you've asked me for it. I can't say the same, watching his face right now, for the man standing across this room from us. A long moment held, the whole congregation frozen in it, and then Talmadge's voice, quiet but carrying, broke the silence from the pulpit. I've known Amos Hartwell 20 years, the Reverend said. Never once known him to lie, even when a lie would have served him easier than the truth. I've known Silas Cobb near as long, and I've watched him buy his way through this valley, one quiet transaction at a time, and I confess, standing here now, that I find myself considerably less surprised by what's laid out on that table than I suspect some of you are. Another voice, rougher, unexpected, came from near the back Otis Ferris. On his feet, his face carrying an expression Amos had never once seen on him before, something close to shame. I'll say a thing too, since we're all airing things this morning. I told Hartwell weeks back to be careful, having a stranger under his roof. I've thought on that since, more than I've been comfortable thinking on much of anything lately, and I've come to believe I was wrong to say it, and wronger still in why I said it. He looked at Wren, direct, and something in the look carried an apology plainer than any words he could have chosen. You did this valley a kindness, miss, and it repaid you with suspicion. That's a poor showing on our part, and I mean to say so plain, whatever else comes of this morning. Corwin stood a long moment, looking at the evidence laid out on the table, at Cobb's ashen, cornered face, at the room full of witnesses who had, in the space of a few short minutes, watched a story they'd half believed collapse in front of them and a different one rise up to take its place. Mr. Cobb, Corwin said, finally, his voice gone hard in a way Amos hadn't heard it before, I'll need you to accompany me. There are questions here that go considerably beyond my discretion to set aside, and I expect a formal inquiry will want every piece of what's on this table, along with Mr. Dell's account, entered plain into the record. Cobb didn't move for a long moment, and when he finally did, it was with none of his usual unhurried confidence, a man walking out of a room that had, for the first time in 8 years, stopped being his to control. They didn't linger in the church themselves. Once the room had begun to stir and murmur and break apart into the small clusters people form when they need to talk over something too large to hold quietly alone. Amos gathered the evidence back into the satchel, careful, and found his hands, steady through the whole confrontation, had begun trembling again now that there was nothing left to hold them steady against. Wren noticed. She always noticed. She didn't say anything about it, only walked close beside him out into the cold, bright afternoon, her shoulder near enough to his that he could feel the warmth of her through both their coats, and it was only once they'd reached the horses, out of easy earshot of the dispersing crowd, that she finally spoke. "You did that well," she said. "Steadier than I expected, given how little you'd slept these last nights worrying over it. Didn't feel steady. Felt like I might come apart the whole time I was talking. That's what steady looks like, mostly," she said, from the outside. "Nobody feels it from the inside, near as calm as it looks to everybody watching." She swung up onto the mule and looked back at him, something warm moving across her face that he was coming, slowly, to recognize his simple pride, offered without any of the careful reserve she'd guarded so closely those first weeks. "I'm proud of you, Amos Hartwell." "Wanted you to hear that," said Plain, not just felt. He felt the words settle into him, warm, the way little in his life had settled warm in a long, long while. "Wouldn't have had the nerve for any of it, without you standing there beside me." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe you'd have found it anyway. Given enough time. I've come to believe a person generally has more nerve sitting in them than they credit themselves with. Sometimes it just takes somebody else showing up to prove it's there." They rode home together, unhurried. The whole valley behind them changed in some way. Amos didn't yet have the distance to fully measure, and it wasn't until they'd nearly reached the ranch that he realized he'd spent the entire ride smiling, without once deciding to. The valley's memory, Amos would learn over the weeks that followed, was a fickle thing, quick to condemn, and, it turned out, nearly as quick to reconsider once the evidence for reconsidering was laid out. Plain enough that even careful men couldn't look away from it. Cutler sent word within the week that he'd be glad to resume the old terms of business. No hard feelings. And Amos found he could forgive the man easier than he'd expected, understanding by then how much easier it was to stay quiet than to stand against a story already moving through a small town under its own momentum. Denby rode out himself, a thing Amos had never once seen the man do in 22 years of being his neighbor, and stood in the yard turning his hat in his hands, with an awkwardness that made him, for the first time Amos could recall, seem almost human. "I've been a poor neighbor to you," Denby said. "Longer than just these last weeks. I'll not pretend otherwise, and I'll not ask you to forget it easy. But I'd like to start doing better. If you'll let me, starting with an order for 2 of your yearling fillies, at whatever fair price you're asking these days. I hear tell it's considerably closer to what the stock is actually worth than what you were charging before." "Word travels." "It does," Denby said, "when a lieutenant and half the county come to understand. A man's been the honest one all along. Funny how quick a valley remembers its manners, once it's embarrassed enough about forgetting them." Osric wrote too, a letter more apologetic than the man had likely ever put to paper in his life, renewing his interest in the bay stud colt and offering, unprompted, a price better than the one they'd originally discussed, which Amos understood reading it to be exactly what it was, a guilty man's attempt to purchase back some measure of his own decency alongside the horse. Dell came by the ranch himself, a week or so after the inquiry had formally opened, standing awkward in the yard turning his hat the same nervous way Denby had, though for entirely different reasons. "Wanted to thank you proper," Dell said. "Corwin's put in a word for me with the freight office in town on account of my testimony. Steady work now. First steady work I've had since I left Cobb's employ." He looked down at his hat a moment, then back up, something raw in his face. "Wasn't sure, riding up here that first day you came looking for me, whether speaking plain would cost me more than it was worth. Turned out it was the opposite. Turned out silence was what had been costing me, and I just hadn't let myself see it clear till you 2 came asking. You did a brave thing, Dell." "Didn't feel brave. Felt terrified the whole while." Dell almost smiled at that, the first real ease Amos had seen in the man's face since they'd met him splitting wood in the cold. Suppose that's what it generally feels like, though, doing the right thing instead of the easy one. You'd know that better than most, these last 2 months. Talmadge, for his part, asked for nothing at all, which Amos had rather expected of him by then, and simply continued riding out now and then of an evening to sit by the fire and talk of nothing in particular, the easy company of a man who'd proven, when it mattered, exactly what kind of friend he intended to be. It was in the middle of that same stretch of quiet weeks, on a night neither of them had expected, that the old gray gelding stablemate, a mare Amos had nearly forgotten was carrying, so far had she fallen from his attention during the worst of the trouble with Cobb, went into labor a full month earlier than either of them had calculated. Wren found her first, as she found most things first, roused by some instinct. Amos still didn't fully understand and didn't need to, and came pounding on his door in the deep cold hour before midnight with an urgency that had him up and dressed and out to the barn before he'd fully finished waking. The mare was down in the straw, sides heaving, and Amos knew inside a minute of looking at her that this wasn't going to be an easy one. The foal was turned wrong. He'd seen it before, twice in 11 years, and both times it had gone badly enough that he still, on quiet nights, remembered the particular helpless feeling of watching an animal labor against odds no amount of careful breeding could account for. Front legs caught back, Wren said, her hands already moving, sure and fast despite the poor lamplight, feeling her way along the mare's straining body with a calm that steadied Amos more than any words could have. I can turn it. Need you holding her still, and I need it done before she tires past managing it. He held. She worked, her arm in past the elbow, her face set in a concentration so complete, it seemed to have swallowed every trace of fear she might otherwise have felt, and the mare screamed once, high and terrible, the sound of it going through Amos like a blade. And then, all at once, something gave, and Wren's arm came free, and the foal's small wet shape slid into the straw, and the cold lantern light, and the whole of a life it hadn't yet had the chance to properly begin. For one long, terrible second it didn't move Amos, Wren's voice tight, rub him, hard now. He dropped beside her and did as she said, working a rough scrap of sacking over the foal's small ribs, with more force than he'd have thought a newborn thing could bear, and just when he'd begun to believe the worst had already happened, the small chest hitched and shuddered and drew its first ragged breath, and the foal's head came up, wet and startled and entirely, gloriously alive. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that. They simply knelt together in the straw, breathing hard, watching a colt they hadn't expected to see for another month, find his feet in fits and starts, wobbling, falling, trying again, the mare nickering low and exhausted encouragement the whole while. That was close, Amos said finally, his voice rough. It was, Wren agreed. She sat back on her heels, wiping her arm on a clean cloth, and looked at him across the small space between them, lamplight, catching the exhaustion and the relief and something else, something warmer, moving plain across her face for once, without any of her usual careful reserve holding it back. You did well, holding her steady like that. Some men panic in a moment like that one. You didn't. Had good instruction. Had good instinct, she said. I only told you what to do. The doing was yours. They stayed in the barn a while longer, watching the colt find his legs properly at last, and make his first uncertain steps toward his dam, and Amos felt something settle over him in that lamplit quiet that he recognized, slowly, as an echo of a feeling he'd thought, 15 years ago, he'd lost the capacity to feel again. Not just relief, not just the particular satisfaction of a hard job done right. Something closer to belonging to standing in exactly the place he was meant to be standing, beside exactly the person he was meant to be standing beside, watching a new life take its first uncertain steps into a world that had, for once, decided to be kind to it. Wren's shoulder was close against his, the way it had been the night of the church, the way it seems more and more these days, to simply belong there, without either of them needing to remark on it. Neither of them moved away. He's going to be something, Wren said quietly, watching the colt. He is, Amos agreed. And that, for the moment, was the whole of the conversation. And it was enough. It was a clear evening, near 3 weeks after the church, that Amos found himself standing at the south pasture rail beside Wren, watching the horses move easy through the last gold light of a day that had, for once, held nothing more dramatic in it than ordinary ranch work, mending, feeding, the small, unremarkable business of a life, slowly returning to something like its proper shape. Cobb's case goes before the circuit judge next month, he said. Corwin tells me the county's got enough now to see him ruined proper. Land sees to cover what he owes, most likely. Might even see time behind it, given what Dell's willing to swear to. Good, Wren said simply, and there was no triumph in the word, only the plain satisfaction of a wrong finally set right. They stood a while in silence, the comfortable kind now, the kind that had stopped needing filling somewhere in the last 2 months, without either of them marking exactly when. You'll be moving on, I expect, Amos said finally, the words costing him more than he'd anticipated they would. Now that the trouble's settled, Caldwell Wells, or wherever the road takes you next. Wren didn't answer right away. She looked at the horses instead, at the bay stud colt running easy circles around the mares, young and strong and entirely unaware of how close he'd once come to never existing at all. I've thought on that, she said. Thought on it more than I've let on these last weeks. She turned to look at him, and something in her face, open now in a way he'd rarely seen it, carried more weight than any of her careful, flat statements ever had. I've spent a long while now moving, because staying felt like a risk I couldn't afford. Every place I set down roots, somebody's come along eventually to tell me I didn't belong there, or worse, decided the deciding wasn't even mine to make. This isn't that kind of place. Not while I've got any say in it. I know that, she said, quiet. I've watched you prove it these last 2 months in more ways than I've bothered counting. You stood in that church and put your own name and your own land on the table for a woman you'd known less than 8 weeks, because it was right, and because you'd decided. Somewhere along the way, that right mattered more to you than easy. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, the same way she'd held it the very first morning in his yard. I've been asking myself, this last week, what I actually want, now that I'm not running from anything anymore, and I keep landing on the same answer, which is, I want to stay, Wren said, plain, the way she said everything that mattered. Not because I've nowhere else to go, because this is somewhere I've chosen, with clear eyes, knowing exactly what it costs and what it offers. That's a different thing than staying because leaving's too hard. I'd like you to understand the difference, because it matters to me that you do. Amos felt something in his chest come loose entirely, the last of some old, careful grief finally letting go its grip after 15 long years of holding on out of habit more than any real necessity anymore. I understand it, he said, and I'd like that, more than I've let myself want anything in a long while. He was quiet a moment, turning something over the way he'd turned over the cut wire, the survey stake, every hard fact this valley had handed him these last 2 months. Except this turning wasn't hard at all. This turning was the easiest thing he'd done in 15 years. There's a thing I haven't said plain, he went on, and I find I'd like to, before either of us lets tonight pass without it being said. I don't know rightly what to call what's grown up between us these 2 months. Wasn't looking for it, wasn't sure. Honestly, I had it left in me to find. But I know I look forward to mornings now in a way I hadn't in 15 years. Know I've caught myself, more than once, watching you cross this yard and forgetting, for a whole minute, at a stretch, every single hard thing weighing on either of us. That's not nothing, Wren. Not to a man my age who'd made his peace with never feeling it again. Wren was quiet a long moment, the evening light gone soft and gold around them both, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped. Careful, the particular careful of a person handling something she'd decided at last was safe enough to hold without armor. I've felt it too, she said. Been feeling it a good while now, if I'm honest, and being honest with myself about it has taken longer than I'm proud of. I told you once, that first week, that I'd had enough of people's pity for one lifetime. This isn't pity, what's between us. I'd know the difference. I've felt enough of both in my life to tell them apart clean. What is it then, if you had to call it plain? She considered that, the way she considered most things, unhurried, weighing it honest before she'd let it out into the air between them. Respect first, she said. That's the foundation of it, and I don't believe either of us would want it built on anything less solid. And past that she paused, and something almost shy moved across her face, an expression so unlike her usual flat certainty that Amos found himself holding his breath waiting for the rest of it. Past that, something I haven't let myself feel toward another person in longer than I care to count. I'm not opposed to naming it plain, Amos Hartwell, if you're not. I'm not opposed, he said, and the words came out rougher than he'd intended. Weighted with everything they'd both spent 2 months not quite saying. Then I'd call it love, she said, simple, unadorned, the way she said everything true, plain and honest, same as everything else I've told you. since the morning I rode into this yard." He reached for her hand where it rested on the fence rail, and she let him take it, her fingers closing around his with the same sure, unhesitating grip she'd used the very first day to check a mare's swollen leg, to hold a rope, to steady a frightened animal's trust. Two people who had each, in their own hard way, stopped believing they had any right left to want something this simple, standing together at a fence rail, in the last gold light of an ordinary evening, having finally said the truest thing either of them had to offer. "Then I'd call it the same," Amos said. "Love, plain and honest." Spring came properly to the valley some weeks after that, the way it always eventually did in that country, arriving all at once after a winter that seemed determined to hold on past its welcome, and Amos found himself, that season, doing work he'd nearly forgotten the particular satisfaction of not surviving a season, but building through one. 3-4 foals came that spring besides the early colt, born the night of the difficult labor, all of them out of the mares he'd spent 11 careful years building toward, all of them sound, all of them carrying forward the bloodlines he'd once nearly lost entirely to a storm and a greedy man's calculated cruelty. Word of the bay stud colt's quality traveled the valley the way word of a good horse always traveled in a small place, faster and further than any single man could account for, and buyers began arriving again, not out of guilt this time, not the careful apologetic business of men trying to purchase back their own decency, but out of plain honest interest in stock that had, by any fair measure, earned its reputation the hard way. Cobb's trial came and went at the circuit court 2 counties over, and Amos and Wren rode in to give their testimony alongside Dell's, and watched a judge who had no particular stake in Larkin's Crossing's opinion of in mighty way the evidence, laid out plain and rule accordingly. Amos remembered little of the proceedings themselves in any great detail. Afterward, the particular numbness of finally standing before official process after weeks of fighting through informal channels, the dry recitation of facts he'd once found so frightening now reduced to careful legal language. What he remembered clearly was Wren's testimony, given plain and unhurried in front of a room of strangers who owed her nothing, and had, at the start, plainly expected considerably less credibility from her than they'd extended to Cobb's own lawyer. She'd changed their minds within the first 5 minutes, not through any particular eloquence, but through the same unshakable, unadorned honesty she brought to everything, a woman describing exactly what she'd seen and exactly how she'd seen it, refusing every attempt the lawyer made to rattle her into contradiction or exaggeration, until even the judge, by the end of it, was nodding along with the particular respect one careful, precise mind extends to another. Cobb lost the land he'd been building his fortune on for 8 years, forfeited to cover what the court determined he owed, and though Amos took no particular pleasure in watching a man's life come apart, even a man who'd earned the coming apart as thoroughly as Cobb had, he found he slept easier once the whole business was formally finished. Denby bought 2 of the season's foals outright, at a price that made Amos, checking the figures against Wren's careful projections, laugh out loud for the sheer unexpected pleasure of watching numbers finally land exactly where they'd promised to land. The old rancher had taken, this last while, to riding out now, and then simply to look at the herd, standing at the fence rail, with the particular quiet appreciation of a man who understood good breeding when he saw it and had, for 2 years, been too proud or too careless to admit that the best stock in the valley had been standing in his own neighbor's pasture the whole while. Funny thing, a valley's memory, Denby said, on one of those visits, watching the bay colt move easy across the pasture, quick to think the worst, slower but not unwilling, it turns out, to think better once it's given honest reason to. Some reasons take longer to arrive than others, Amos said. They do, Denby agreed, grateful yours finally did. That night, with the horses settled and the fire banked low, Amos took down Ruth's old ledger one final time before bed, and beneath the entry he'd made weeks before 12 horses returned, wire cut, Stakes found he added a new line, in a hand steadier now than it had been that first frightened night. Cobb exposed, debt to the valley repaid, slow one honest transaction at a time. He looked at the words a long while. Simple facts, laid down flat, the way Ruth had always laid them down, though he suspected, closing the book, that she'd have recognized more feeling folded into these particular 3 lines than into any other entry in the whole worn history of that ledger. He thought, sitting there with the book still open beneath the lamp, of the morning this had all started the cold coffee, the boots set by the door, the particular quiet of a man who'd decided, quietly and without ceremony, that his life had already delivered whatever it intended to deliver him, and that whatever remained was simply the slow business of enduring what was left. He'd been wrong about that morning in ways he was still, even now, discovering the full shape of. Not just about the horses, about the whole of what a man his age, carrying his particular weight of grief and years, might still reasonably hope to build. He thought Ruth would have liked her, not in any small or careful way, but plainly, thoroughly, the way Ruth had liked anyone who looked at a hard truth without flinching from it. He thought, closing the book at last, that some part of Ruth's own steady clarity had somehow found its way, across 15 years and an impossible distance, into the woman now moving quietly in the next room, and that this fact, rather than feeling like any kind of betrayal of what he'd once had, felt instead like a gift won grief, honored fully, making room at last for a second chance neither of them had asked for, but both, in their own hard way, had earned. And he banked the fire, he checked the window latch, out of habit more than need, and through the wall, faint, he could hear Wren moving in the spare room that had stopped, sometime in these last 2 months, feeling like a spare room at all, and had started, instead, to feel like simply her room in a house that had finally, after 15 long years of careful survival, become something worth calling a home again. Outside, the mares moved easy through the darkening pasture, unhurried, unbothered, the way well-kept horses always moved when the danger circling them had finally, truly passed. Come next spring, there'd be foals again, the bay colt's own get. Some of them, carrying forward 11 years of careful choices into a future that, for the first time in longer than Amos could accurately measure, felt entirely certain to arrive. He stood a moment at the window, looking out at the barn, at the single lamp still burning low where Wren had left it, lit for the night watch on a mare not due for weeks yet, out of habit, out of the same careful thoroughness that had brought her riding into his yard, on a cold morning, with all 12 of his horses in tow, and changed, without either of them fully understanding it yet, the whole shape of what remained of both their lives. That small square of lamplight, steady against the dark, was the last thing he saw before he finally turned in for the night, the same small light. He thought that would likely still be burning there years from now, on some other cold night, tending some other mare through some other difficult birth, because that was simply who she was, and he understood, standing there, that he intended to spend whatever years remained to him, watching that particular light burn steady in his own barn window, grateful, every single time, that it was there at all. The arithmetic, he thought, closing the curtain at last, had finally, after everything, worked out fine.